All right, so today I'm going to be making a very special announcement at some point in this YouTube video. I'm not going to tell you what the announcement is now, of course, but I'll give you a little hint. We're going to be adding something to the Ballin universe. So be sure you stick around to hear today's announcement. Today, I'm going to share 3 totally bizarre missing person stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice fresh ice cream cone, but don't tell them you've secretly hid a glass shard in the middle of it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of October 11th, 2016, a middle-aged man named Carlos Herrera Sr. entered the visitation area of a prison in Venezuela. The room itself sort of looked like a high school cafeteria, with tables and chairs everywhere for the inmates and their visitors to sit down and have their meetings. And right in front of one was one table where there was this bedraggled-looking prisoner who he was there to meet. As Juan got closer to this guy, he could see he really looked terrible, the inmate. I mean, his cheekbones were sticking out, he was sort of emaciated, he was bloodied and bruised, he had bandages on his arm. And also, as Juan moved towards this guy, he could clearly see all the guards that lined the walls and the exits of this visitation area sort of squirm with discomfort, as this meeting is about to take place. And Juan had a good idea why these guards might be anxious. And that's because over the past month, this prison had been on lockdown because a gang inside the prison had risen up and overpowered the guards and completely taken over for this entire month. And just to be clear, during this month, people died as a result of this takeover. This was a horrible month for this prison, and it was only over the past couple of days that the guards were finally able to take back control. And Juan knew all this, not only because this riot was all over the news while it was going on, but also because his own son, Juan Jr., was serving time in this prison for robbery. He had been for the past year. However, Juan Sr. was not coming to visit his son right now. Instead, he was coming to visit a different prisoner, because during this riot, Juan Jr. had just disappeared. And Juan Sr., when he had found out about that, had called prison officials, other people, politicians, you name it, to try to figure out where his son went, but nobody seemed to know. And so finally, he had found this one prisoner, the guy he was meeting today, this beaten down looking guy, who had agreed to come forward and tell Juan Sr. what he knew about what happened to Juan Jr. And so Juan sat down at this table with this prisoner, and after the two of them introduced themselves, very quickly, Juan Sr. said, please, tell me what happened to my son, where is he? But this prisoner he was talking to didn't immediately get into sort of a clear story about Juan Jr. This guy began talking about a totally separate prisoner, a man named Dorangel Vargas. Vargas was notorious across Venezuela for a series of brutal murders he committed that ultimately put him in this prison. And during this recent riot at this prison, it was Vargas and his gang that rose up and took over. Vargas was in charge, effectively, of the riot. And so even though he was terrorizing people and brutalizing people and was very much responsible for the deaths of multiple inmates, he also at the same time did have to make sure that, the people he was in charge of, albeit illegally, had enough food, they had enough supplies, that they had the things they needed to survive. And so again, he's sort of dictatorial and awful, but also, ensuring people have basic resources. And so Juan Sr. is listening to this man sort of lay this out about Vargas and sort of how he was in control during this riot. And Juan Sr. is like, I just don't get it. Why are you explaining the nuances of what he was doing during the riot? And this prisoner very quickly pointed to the bandage on his arm and kind of pointed at all of his injuries that were very obvious. And he told Juan Sr. that if anybody got in the way of Vargas while he was in charge during this riot, they were basically beaten to within an inch of their lives. And again, in some cases, people were killed. This was a brutal regime. And so Juan Sr. is like, oh my goodness, is that what happened to my son? Was he beaten like you by Vargas? But at that point, the prisoner just shook his head and said no. And then he looked down and almost couldn't make eye contact with Juan Sr. And he just said, what happened to your son was much worse. The prisoner would tell Juan Sr. that at some point during the riot, his son, Juan Jr., was tapped by Vargas to help with something. Now, it's not clear if Jr. went willingly or he was coerced, but we know that basically everybody had to do what Vargas asked them to do, otherwise they would be beaten or even killed. And so ultimately, Jr. agrees to help Vargas. And the thing he was tapped to help Vargas with was distributing food to the inmates. Because remember, despite how brutal Vargas was, he was in charge of providing basic necessities to all the inmates. And because of this riot, the prison had been locked down, and so food supplies had been restricted. And so inmates are beginning to starve, there's this big food shortage. And so Jr. was told, like, hey, you need to help us provide food to these inmates. So Jr. basically agreed to do it, at which point he was informed exactly what role he was playing in finding food. Instead of going out and looking for this food, Jr. was the food. Vargas and his gang cornered Jr., beat him to death, butchered his body, and then literally fed him to the inmates. That's what happened to Juan's son. After hearing this horrific story, Juan Sr. was destroyed. And one of the first things he did is he went public and had this big press conference to tell the world about what happened to his son. But despite there being many eyewitness accounts, ultimately, the Venezuelan government denied the cannibalism and nobody was ever held accountable. Duranhel Vargas remains incarcerated and he's never been charged with any crimes connected to Junior's disappearance. Okay, as promised, here is today's special announcement. As of right now, we have a brand new show, a history podcast. But wait, it's not like a boring history show. This is not like, when you were in school and you had to sit through lectures about something that happened hundreds, thousands of years ago. It's not that. We're going to pull from history, but we're going to tell the true stories behind moments in history. We're going to give you stories that feel like MrBallen's stories with plot twists and crazy point of views. It's going to be classic Ballen's storytelling, but again, historical is the context. Here, let me give you an example. So if you look back and try to identify the first time true crime sort of became a thing, that the public was suddenly interested in a case that really had nothing to do with them just because it was entertaining, that case would be about this murderer who escaped. And that's kind of all that's available if you look it up. Oh, yep, escaped murderer, that's when true crime became a thing. But did you know that that case, the escaped murderer, was way more compelling and exciting than most people give it credit for? People were interested at the time because there was this crazy transatlantic boat chase, and there was this crazy hunt for the killer, and the killing itself was so grisly, and that story really doesn't get told much. It's just kind of a statistic in a history book. And so what this podcast does is it finds cases like that and actually shows you why history is so cool and so interesting. And that's just episode 1. So this new history podcast is called A Twist of History, and it's live right now. So go to any platform where you get your podcasts and look up A Twist of History, or just search for Ballen Studios and you can find it that way. Follow the show and tune in each week. And if you really want to, give us a 5-star review. The show is totally free, new episodes every Wednesday. Oh, and one more thing, be sure to stick around till the end of today's YouTube video for a sneak peek of episode 1. At around 8 p.m. on August 19, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raimundo Marfa da Silva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raimundo lived in this shack with his father Rivelino, as well as his 2 younger brothers, who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room, only a few feet away. Raimundo and his family were very, very poor. The shack was very small. It was only composed of 2 rooms, the main room he was in right now, and also the kitchen, which was connected by a single door. And they were truly like out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money. They really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raimundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, there wasn't really much else to do here, his father, Rivelino, came into the room from the kitchen and he sat down next to him. And the two just sat there quietly, periodically poking at the fire with a stick and just sitting there enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the 2 younger brothers. And as these 2 were sitting there, suddenly Raimundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. And so he turned his attention and he looked into the dark kitchen, and he saw this dark figure on all fours quickly kind of maneuvering across the ground out of sight. And immediately Raimundo's terrified. He has no idea what this is. And so instinctively he turns to his dad, and his dad is also staring at the kitchen, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. And then before Raimundo could do anything, his dad jumped up and slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. And at that point, the two younger brothers, they've woken up, and all four of them are looking at each other like, what's going on? And Raimundo, he says to his dad, what was that? Now, it was clear that Rivellino was very unsettled by whatever this was. I mean, they didn't have pets. There was no other people inside of their shack. Like, there shouldn't be anything alive inside of the shack beyond them. So he doesn't know what it is. He's scared, but he tells his boys, it's okay. It's all right. I don't know what that is, but let's just stay here. We're safe. The door is locked. We're all here. We're safe. And so the boys, they all just kind of trusted their dad, and everybody just kind of hunkered down together and just sat there quietly, kind of waiting to see if they would hear anything else. And for a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Rivellino and his sons began to hear voices, and they were coming from outside the shack. And at first, they couldn't really tell what these voices were saying. They were kind of garbled. But eventually, they all began to hear the same thing. Whoever was out there, or whatever was out there, was talking about Rivellino. Specifically, they could hear that name. And what they were kind of saying is, if Rivellino comes out here, we're going to kill him. And the moment that all the boys sort of picked up the fact that somebody's out there and they're threatening to harm Rivellino, they're all like, Dad, what do we do? What do we do? And Rivellino, I mean, he's hearing this too, but he tells his boys, it's okay. I don't know what's going on out there, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This is a prank. This can't be real. And so Rivellino told his sons, their plan is they're just going to stay put. They're in this room, they're safe, the door is locked. We are going to wait until the sun comes up, and then we'll figure out who did this, who's playing this prank on us. And so sure enough, Rivellino and his sons would stay in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m. when the sun began to come up again. And at that point, Rivellino told his sons to stay put, and he was going to go out there and investigate. And by this point, they had stopped hearing voices. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. It sort of felt like whatever that was, whoever that was, had passed. And so, the tension is gone, and the boys are like, okay, be careful out there, Dad. And so Rivellino, he walks over to the door that leads into the kitchen. He unlocks it, opens it up. And Raimundo, he's craning his neck, looking into the kitchen, but, he can't see anything moving around in there, even with the light coming in. And so Rivellino, he says, okay, boys, stay here. And then Rivellino goes out into the kitchen and shuts the door behind him. And while he's out there, Raimundo and his brothers, they're all listening anxiously, making sure their dad's not in trouble, but they just hear the sound of their dad just clearly walking around the kitchen. There's no commotion, there's nothing. And then a couple of minutes later, Rivellino comes back into the main room where the boys are, and he's got a knife in hand, but he tells them, it's okay, I got this from the kitchen, I'm just in case. There's nothing out here. I'm now going to go outside and just make sure nobody's outside the hut, okay? So again, stay put. I'll be right back. And so again, the boys, they're looking at their dad like, okay, we'll see you soon. Rivellino walked out again into the kitchen. He shut the door behind him, and then the boys heard the sound of the door that led outside open up. And then, presumably, Rivellino went outside. And that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from Raimundo's family's shack. And at some point, they came across this huge boulder. And this boulder had a big crevice in it, like a big gap in this rock. And one of the hunters happened to walk past it and looked into this crevice, and they found a skeleton. And that skeleton belonged to Rivellino, Raimundo's father. But that was not the end of the story. Far from it. So on the day that Rivellino stepped out the front door and then was never heard from again, Raimundo and his brothers had been instructed by their dad to stay put while Rivellino went out looking around. But Raimundo just felt really nervous after his dad had stepped out the front door and had presumably stepped outside. So he defied his father, he opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and as soon as he did, he looked towards the door that led outside, and he saw it was wide open. And he saw his dad stepping into this huge cloud of yellow smoke. And amidst this smoke were these like cylindrical objects that were floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, seemingly spitting out this smoke. And Raimundo, he had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad just kind of walking into this cloud, and then the smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad. His dad was gone. And so Raimundo yelled out for his dad, like, "Dad, where are you going?" And he charged towards his father to try to stop him. He just felt like, you can't go out there. But as soon as Raimundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated, the cylinders disappeared, and as soon as it was all gone, his dad was gone too. Raimundo sprinted around his house, calling out for his dad, looking everywhere, but there was no sign of him. And so quickly, Raimundo and his brothers alerted authorities, and they launched this search for him, and for days they combed the area near that boulder as well, and they couldn't find Rivellino. And so eventually, they abandoned the search, and then 6 months later, his body was magically found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Rivellino and how he wound up inside of that rock crevice. Also, people have no idea what that dark figure was skittering across their kitchen floor the night before Rivellino went missing, or who those voices were threatening to kill Rivellino, or the objects that Raimundo apparently saw floating in the sky spitting out yellow smoke. Nobody has any idea what any of that stuff is. All we know is Rivellino disappeared and 6 months later turned up dead in that crevice. On the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close. They had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents had gone through a really messy divorce, and during it, their father had just walked out on them and they never saw him again. And shortly after that, their mother remarried and her new husband moved in with the family, and shortly after that, their mother just vanished. And the boys, they asked their stepfather, like, where is she? Where's she gone? But the stepdad would say, I don't know. She went out on an errand and she never came back. And the boys, they were very suspicious of their stepfather because this did not feel like something their mom would do. Like, she would not abandon them. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. And so all of a sudden, these teenage boys are just left to fend for themselves. Now, the boys would contact police, and specifically they said, like, hey, we think something happened to our mom. We think maybe our stepdad had something to do with it, but everybody's abandoned us. And the police would launch an investigation, and they would go looking for their mother, but they couldn't find her. And they couldn't find the stepfather or the biological father. And so after the police wound down their investigation, the two boys, again, they've been orphaned now, and they, learned to fend for themselves, but they never stopped looking for their mom. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City for their mother, and they just could never get any sort of closure. They really didn't know what happened to her. And so today, the two brothers had met up, not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. So after their mother and stepfather and their biological father had abandoned them, the two boys had lived in the childhood home on their own, fending for themselves. They had grown up there. And then eventually, when they were old enough, they had moved out and started their own adult lives on their own, but they had never sold the house. They had just kind of kept it in their possession and let it sit there. But now they were going back to, go through and sort of clean it up and, decide if they wanted to do some renovations and just kind of fix the place up, maybe to sell it. They didn't know. And so the two brothers, they met up at the home, they go inside and, there's still photos on the wall, old family photos. And there's, all these memories that come rushing back, many of which are very sad and troubling. But, like the brothers, they're having a good time, just kind of going down memory lane. And at some point they decide, okay, you know what? Not only are we going to clean this place out, but also there's some basic renovations that really need to happen here. Like the place has been sitting here for years. It's sort of fallen into disrepair. Let's fix this place up. And so over the next couple of days, they would call in some contractors to begin to do some basic renovations in the house while the brothers continued to clean it up and pack things up and sort of get it ready for whatever it was going to be. And on one particular day, when a group of contractors were working in the master bedroom, the brothers were in the living room doing their own thing when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. It's the two brothers, they got up, they bolt into the master suite, and they look at something that was just sitting on the ground. And at first, they didn't even know what they were looking at. But then the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was. And suddenly, the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It would turn out the brothers were right. their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day their mother left and never came back again, somehow or another, she was bound and gagged and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. And we know this because when that contractor 2 decades later was doing renovations for the brothers inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite, and when he pulled it out again, a white object came tumbling out of the wall. And that object was their mother's skull. And after pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they would find the rest of her skeleton, clearly bound and gagged. And then perhaps most disturbingly of all, is that in the wall, they would also find all these scratch marks, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, which means she was in there desperately trying to get the attention of her sons to save her, but nobody could hear her. Following this horrific discovery, the 2 brothers went to police in Mexico City and told them what happened. And the police would come to the house, they would look all over the place and try to figure out, what happened to their mother, who killed her. But they couldn't solve it. Now, the police always did suspect that the stepfather very likely had some level of involvement here, just given the fact that he himself went missing a couple of days after the mother did. But they could never locate him, and very likely they never will, because today he'd be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead. And now, from Ballin Studios, here is a clip of our newest podcast called A Twist of History. After you listen, be sure to look up A Twist of History on whichever podcast platform you listen to and give us a follow and start tuning in. New episodes drop every Wednesday.
It's July 9th, 1910 in London, England. A 16-year-old boy flies down 4 flights of stairs of a concrete office building and steps out onto Borough High Street on the south bank of the River Thames. The noise hits him immediately. People rushing down the sidewalk, the road filled with a mix of horse-drawn buggies and rattling automobiles. The street is so crowded it overwhelms the boy. He quickly pulls his hat down further to partially cover his face and starts weaving his way through the foot traffic. He darts his eyes back and forth, convinced that someone is going to recognize him. He can feel his heartbeat all the way up in his ears. He keeps rushing and scanning the street, but nobody pays any attention to him, so the boy finally relaxes a little. He slows down to a normal walk and makes his way to the entrance of a nearby London Underground station. A few minutes later, the boy sees his father coming towards him, holding a single small suitcase. The boy greets his father, and they run down the steps together in the Underground, just in time to catch the next train. The boy watches the train doors close and the mass of passengers exiting. He looks around to make sure that he still hasn't been recognized by anyone and follows his father on board. As the train car continues to fill up, the boy and his dad lower their heads, avoiding eye contact with their fellow passengers. And finally, the train starts to roll down the underground tracks, and the boy and his father exhale. Their escape from England has begun.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One September afternoon in Taiwan, a young man boarded a public bus for what he thought would be just an ordinary ride home. But it wasn't that. This ride would turn out to be the single most terrifying experience of this guy's life. And we don't just have to take his word for it, because this young man managed to capture a photo of the thing that was terrorizing him on this bus for hours. And so no matter what you think of the story, the picture is fascinating. So make sure you stick around till the end to see that photo. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, on garbage collection day, wake up really early, go to the Like Button's house, and take their full trash cans away from the curb and put them back in their yard, wait for the garbage trucks to come by, and then after they're gone, wheel the Like Button's garbage bins back out to the curb. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of September 4th, 2017, a young man named Zhu rushed through a bus station in southern Taiwan. Zhu's bus home to the capital city, Taipei, would be leaving any minute now, and because Zhu was running late, he knew the bus would be packed and he would get a terrible seat. And so Zhu just kept on running as fast as he could, and he finally saw his bus parked up against the curb on the outside of this bus station, and he ran up to it, totally winded, but glad that he hadn't missed his bus. And so the driver noticed Zhu standing there, and so he opened up the bus doors, and Zhu went on board, handed the driver his ticket, and the driver said, okay, take your seat, and Zhu turned, and he began walking down the aisle, and at first he almost didn't register the weirdness of the inside of this bus. I mean, he took this route all the time, and he was totally expecting this bus to be packed, but as he was walking down the aisle, he realized he was the only one on the bus. There was literally nobody else. It was just Zhu and the driver. And so for a second, Zhu thought maybe he had made a mistake and this was not his bus, but he checked his watch and, again, he had taken this bus many times and he knew this was it. And so he was about to turn and maybe ask the bus driver, but the bus driver shut the doors, turned on the engine, and began to pull away. And so Zhu just thought, well, I guess it's just my lucky day. I have the bus to myself. This is crazy. And so Zhu found a seat towards the front of the bus, and after sitting down and kind of getting situated, he just sat there and stared out the window as the driver, merged into traffic and eventually found their way onto the highway. And as they were just coasting along, Zhu really felt content. I mean, it really felt like he had this private ride all to himself, and this was not a short bus ride. It was like a 6-hour bus ride. And so the idea of just having peace and calm the whole time, that was so luxurious and unexpected. And so Zhu was just having a wonderful time, just kind of taking it all in, when all of a sudden he hears a woman coughing behind him, and remember, he's scanned the bus. It's empty. And so he whipped his head around, totally startled, like maybe there was somebody on the bus, but he looked behind him and there was no one. And so very quickly, Zhu began to rationalize what he had just heard. He's looking around thinking, okay, one of the windows is slightly open. Maybe the wind was coming in weird and causing a sound, or maybe it wasn't behind me. Maybe that cough came from the driver, and somehow I thought it was back here. Zhu's telling himself that wasn't really a woman coughing because there's nobody here. And so before long, Zhu convinced himself that, that was just an anomaly. It was nothing to worry about. And he was back to just relaxing and enjoying this peaceful ride. And pretty soon after that, he began to drift off to sleep. A few hours later, Zhu woke up, and he was very groggy, and he looked out the window and saw it was dark, and he checked his watch and saw they were maybe about halfway to their destination, and then he looked at his phone and saw he had a text message from the friend he had just been visiting, the friend he had been with before he left and got on this bus. And the friend was basically asking Zhu how the ride home was going, and Zhu, he wrote back and said, you won't believe this, I'm on a bus that's completely empty, like I have the bus to myself. And this friend, who was familiar with how packed this particular ride to Taipei was like, no way, that bus is never not filled with people. You gotta send me proof. And so Zhu opened the camera on his phone, he turned around, and he snapped a photo of the back of the bus. But when he looked at the photo he had taken, it was very grainy, and there wasn't any light in the bus, and there wasn't a flash on his phone. And so instead, Zhu, who happened to be a semi-professional photographer, he pulled out his really nice high-quality digital camera out of his bag, and with that camera, he turned around and took a photo. But when Zhu looked at the photo he had just taken, he thought there was something wrong with it. And so he zoomed in on the photo and he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And so he checked all the settings of his camera and checked the lens to make sure everything was working properly, and it was. And so starting to get kind of scared, Zhu put the camera down and walked to the back of the bus and walked up and down a couple of times looking for some explanation of what was in that photo. But there was no explanation, and so now feeling really scared, Zhu went back to his seat, grabbed his phone to text his friend to be like, look what I found, but his phone was dead. Even though his phone had full battery like a minute ago, now his phone doesn't work and he can't turn it back on. And so Zhu's thinking, what do I do? Do I tell the bus driver about this photo? But he was worried if he showed the driver, it would be so startling that the driver might crash the bus. And so Zhu really felt completely alone and terrified, and he just placed his camera next to him and then just closed his eyes and began silently praying that he would get off this bus. But as he was doing that, he began to hear whispering right behind him, like numerous people whispering right behind him. And he whipped his head around, but again, there's nobody there. And so now, the fear is only getting more and more heightened inside of Zhu. He goes back to praying. And now, in addition to the whispers behind him, he starts to hear the sound of seats basically creaking as if somebody's sitting in them, kind of rocking back and forth. And now Zhu, he's too scared to turn around. And so he just keeps on praying and praying. And the noise behind him, this cacophony of sounds, is getting louder and louder. And finally, Zhu looks up at the driver, hoping the driver can hear the stuff, to confirm that Zhu's not losing his mind here. But the driver looked like he was just paying attention to the road, completely oblivious to what was happening inside of this bus. And so Zhu is horrified, has no idea what to do. These noises are not stopping, despite the fact nobody else is on this bus. And so Zhu finally plugged his ears just so he wouldn't hear it, and just tucked himself down in a ball and just continued to pray for the next 3 hours, all the way until the bus finally stopped. And when the bus stopped, Zhu unplugged his ears and opened his eyes, expecting to hear all these whispers and sounds, but the bus sounded totally quiet and normal. And the bus driver, was kind of going through the shutdown procedures of the bus. They were in the Taipei bus station. And so Zhu was feeling totally relieved here, and he couldn't wait to get off this bus. And so Zhu, he grabbed his camera and his things, packed them all up, and then as quick as he could, he began walking towards the front of the bus. But before Zhu got off the bus, the driver stopped him because he saw, Zhu looked horrible. He was sweating profusely. His skin was flushed. He looked like, something bad had just happened to him. And he asked Zhu, like, hey, are you okay? And Zhu was about to be like, oh, no, everything's fine, and just kind of get off the bus. But then he thought to himself, I have no explanation for what just happened. And that was horrifying. I don't know what that was. And I took this photo that I can't explain too, that seems definitely connected to all the noises I just heard. And now that the bus has stopped, there's no risk of showing the driver and risking scaring him so badly that we crash. And so Zhu thought, you know what, even if it makes me look crazy, I'm going to show the driver this photo and see what he thinks. And so Zhu was like, actually, let me show you something. So he pulls out his camera and he shows the driver the photo. And as the driver is kind of looking at the photo, not really sure what to look for, Zhu, he reaches down and he zooms in on the top half of the photo, and it expands the ceiling of the back of the bus. And you can very clearly see there is a huge human arm and hand extending off the ceiling, like it's reaching down into the bus. And so as the bus driver is studying this arm and hand, Zhu is saying, I thought for a second that could have been me, reflected off the ceiling or something, but I was holding the camera in my hand, and so wouldn't the camera be in the reflection? If that's my arm, wouldn't the camera be visible? Because it's not. And then Zhu also was like, I thought for a second maybe it was your arm, but you're driving the bus. Your hands are on the steering wheel. And so if this arm is your hand, wouldn't the steering wheel be in the reflection? Like, I don't understand how there's an arm with nothing in the hand reaching down from the ceiling. And then Zhu also told the driver that in addition to this totally terrifying photo of this ghost arm coming off the ceiling, there were all these weird whispers and sounds and noises behind him for the whole ride. Like, it was horrifying. And so after Zhu has detailed to this bus driver that basically your bus is haunted and I have photo proof, Zhu is expecting the driver to have a pretty big reaction to this. I mean, geez, this is pretty big news here. But the driver just handed the camera back to Zhu and basically turned to Zhu and said, you know what? You can't show this photo to anybody. Like, no one can know about what happens on my bus, because if they find out, it'll ruin my business. And Zhu's thinking, wait a minute, does this mean the bus is haunted? Is that what the bus driver is confirming here? He doesn't seem shocked. He seems like this is completely routine. This is what happens on his bus. And Zhu was about to protest and be like, are you kidding me? Like, why aren't you telling people about what's happening on your bus? But then Zhu was like, you know what? I don't know this guy. I don't care about this bus. You know what? I'm done with this. And so he said to the driver, don't worry, I won't tell anyone about, your haunted bus. I won't show anyone this photo. Thank you. And then Zhu got off the bus. When Zhu finally got to his house, it was around midnight and Zhu was exhausted. So he goes inside, he lays on his couch and he plugs his phone in because his phone was dead. And as soon as his phone turned on, he saw all these messages from his friend who had asked him to send proof that the bus he was on was really empty. And so Zhu wanted to tell his friend about all the crazy stuff that had happened on the bus. He wanted to send him that photo of, the ghost arm. But also, Zhu had promised the bus driver not to share this information with anyone because it could destroy this guy's business. And so as he was sitting there kind of wondering how to respond, something caught Zhu's attention outside. And so he turned and looked out the window, and he saw all these people walking down the road carrying red lanterns. And suddenly, everything sort of clicked for Zhu. It was September 5th, which is important because it marked the beginning of a big event in Taiwan known as the Hungry Ghost Festival, and the people Zhu saw outside walking around with red lanterns were clearly participating in this event. This festival is celebrated every year in Taiwan, and it's all about honoring the dead and feeding them with offerings. For example, people will burn fake money they call ghost money, and once it gets burned, the spirits of the dead can use that money during the ghost month. People in Taiwan believe that during this ghost month, the gates of heaven and hell open up, and spirits come out and walk the earth alongside all the living, which could be a great thing. If you have a dead loved one or friend or somebody, you can reconnect with them during this event, but it also can be a bad thing because sometimes angry spirits emerge from the gates of hell and they wreak havoc on the living. And so as soon as Zhu realized that, today was the start of this Hungry Ghost Festival, he realized why the day before, when he was on that bus, he realized why it was empty. Because there's this superstition in Taiwan that September 4th, the day before this festival, is the day when all the spirits are traveling around the globe. And it's believed that that day is a very dangerous day for the living to be out and about, because you don't want to come in contact by accident with, one of the evil spirits. And so nobody travels on September 4th. But Zhu had just forgotten and just believed he had struck luck by having this empty bus. But then, as Zhu was kind of working this through in his mind, he was thinking, wait a minute, all that weird stuff on the bus, the whispers, the sounds, the ghost arm reaching out of the ceiling that he got on camera, was that some sign that he had just come in contact with an evil spirit? Was he now in danger? Was this spirit gonna follow him around and haunt him? He didn't know. But now he's thinking, oh my goodness, I did the thing I wasn't supposed to do, and now I could be paying the consequences for it. And so Zhu suddenly was like, you know what? I don't care that I made some promise to the bus driver about not disclosing this photo or what I experienced on the bus, because now this is like a me problem. I could have big issues here. And so he decided he would send this photo to his friend and tell his friend about what he experienced on the bus to see what his friend thought. And so after messaging his friend wrote back that he was horrified by that photo, seeing that arm reaching down out of the ceiling. That was horrifying. And his friend didn't know what to make of it and did agree that, given the fact that the Hungry Ghost Festival has just started and you were out there on the day before, this isn't good. You could have come in contact with an evil spirit here. But his friend also gave Zhu some advice of how to handle this. He told Zhu to take that photo and post it on Facebook. Now that sounds kind of goofy, but in Taiwan, there's this belief that if you have bad luck, the best way to deal with bad luck is to basically dilute that bad luck by sharing it with other people. It's kind of like those old email forwards that people used to pass around, like, hey, forward this email along to 5 other people or else you'll have bad luck. It was kind of like that. Just share it with the world and, pass on your bad luck to other people, basically. And so Zhu's friend told Zhu, look, I know this isn't really bad luck we're dealing with here, but maybe if you just share this with the world, dilute what happened to you, maybe that will reduce the power this ghost has over you. It's worth a shot. And so Zhu posted the photo to Facebook, and it pretty much immediately went viral. Millions of people saw it, and this is what Zhu wanted. He wanted, max dilution here, show it to everybody to reduce the chances that this, entity can hurt him. But after all these people saw it, lots of people were spooked, and they began messaging Zhu, not like, don't worry, it's diluted now, but instead they were like, hey man, you're in trouble. This thing's going to come after you. You need to seek real help here. You're in danger. And so this ended up freaking out Zhu more than the photo did in some way. It just made the whole situation feel far more real. And so Zhu ended up deleting the photo on Facebook, setting his Facebook to private, and basically staying off social media. And then he just kind of hoped and prayed that if he did nothing and just stayed home and kind of minded his own business, that he'd be okay. And after a few days, when nothing did happen, ultimately he just told himself, I'm okay. There's no ghosts here. I'm fine. But exactly 1 week after Zhu had got off the bus, so September 11th, 2017, Zhu is in his house, he's laying on the couch, not really thinking about what had happened on the bus, and as he's scrolling social media, he comes across this headline about this horrible accident out on the highway not far from where he lived. And it was this one vehicle that got into this huge wreck, and 6 people were killed and 11 others were injured. I mean, it's this horrible, horrible accident. And as Zhu is like reading the article and scrolling down, he comes across a photo of the driver of this vehicle who's covered head to toe in blood. He looks totally haggard. He's standing out on this dark highway. And Zhu realizes the driver of the vehicle was the bus driver from when he had that horrible experience on the bus. It's the same guy. And so Zhu's like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? He scrolls down and he realizes the vehicle that crashed was the exact same bus he had been riding in when all this stuff happened. It was the same bus driver, same bus on the exact same route that this accident happened. And so obviously this is like a horrifying coincidence. Zhu very likely was thinking, I'm so lucky this didn't happen when I was on the bus. But when you take into context what Zhu experienced on that bus just a week earlier, the photo, the sounds, all of it, this story gets even weirder. Because the official story is the driver was negligent, and that's what caused the crash. That's it. And he actually went to jail for negligence. But there's video footage taken from inside of the bus right before it crashed, and in the final 30 seconds, something strange happens. The driver does not seem distracted at all, he's just driving along, but then something catches his attention, something off to his side. And you can tell right away he notices whatever this thing is, and he's turning, he's looking at this thing, he's not really paying attention to the road, and he starts reaching down. I mean, he's interacting with something in the bus, and you can't see it on camera. And as he gets more and more into dealing with whatever's happening over here, the bus crashes. Now, the driver never gave any public testimony about what was going on right before he crashed. All we have is the fact that it crashed, and this video footage, and Zhu's experience and that photo he took. And when you put it all together, it really makes you wonder if there was any truth to there really being some evil spirit on that bus that maybe did cause this crash. Or is it just a series of unexplainable coincidences? You be the judge. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, at the Like Button's next birthday party, please gift them a 3-year supply of Radithor. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On Monday, May 23rd, 2005, 37-year-old John Wilson got home from a very long day at work and immediately just collapsed into a sofa. John was an oil pipeline inspector in Houston, Texas, and that day it had been extremely hot, and he'd been driving around all these different job sites, and he'd been out in the sun, and he really hadn't had a break. And so now that he was home, he was totally exhausted and knew he should probably just go to bed, but he didn't want to. He didn't want to just go right to bed and then have to get back up again and go right back to work. He wanted to unwind before calling it a night. And so he decided what he would do to unwind would be to go fishing, something he really loved to do. Normally, John did a lot of freshwater fishing, but tonight he decided he would do some saltwater fishing. And so at about 7:30 p.m. that night, he grabbed his fishing rod and his tackle box, he threw it in the back of his pickup truck, and then he hit the road. About an hour and a half later, he had driven all the way south to the very coast of Texas to a beach called Crystal Beach, which is right on the Gulf of Mexico. And instead of parking in one of the parking spaces in the lot, John, like he always did, just drove right through the gate out onto the actual beach. This beach actually had a reputation for having really hard-packed sand, almost like cement, because so many people like John would drive their vehicles out onto the beach. And so he goes through the gate and he drives straight out towards the water. And although it wasn't completely low tide yet, it was making its way towards low tide. And so there was a lot of beach exposed. And so John drove for quite a while, and then he parked still in the tidal zone, but well away from the water. John probably figured that he would not be there long enough for it to matter, because high tide was not for several hours. And so John hops out of his truck, he preps his fishing rod, and he walks out into the actual surf, and he begins to fish. And it would have been very, very peaceful, as there was not really anyone else down there, as it was pretty much the middle of the night. There might have been a couple other fishermen nearby, but that was about it. And for a while, John probably just enjoyed the peace and quiet. He enjoyed fishing. And then after a while, John got overwhelmingly tired. Maybe it was from all the work earlier in the day out in the sun that was just finally catching up to him, or maybe it was all the moving around in the surf, getting knocked around by the water that was making him tired, or maybe it was both. But either way, John decided he wanted to take a nap before he headed home again. And so he left the surf zone, he dropped his fishing rod in the back of his truck, and then he crawled underneath his truck to take a nap. The following morning, a man who was out for a walk near Crystal Beach looked out into the water and he saw a truck was half submerged in the surf zone. And so he called the police, and then the police called a tow truck, and then the tow truck driver showed up to the beach, and when he got there, it was still relatively high tide, and so he had to wait until it was low tide enough that he could actually attach the chains and start pulling this truck out of the surf zone. And so finally, when it was low tide enough, the tow truck driver walked down, and as soon as he was standing next to this partially submerged vehicle, he saw there was a body poking out from underneath it, and that body belonged to John Wilson. No one knows for sure what happened to John after he climbed underneath his truck, but the best guess is after he went under there, he fell asleep and he slept for longer than he anticipated. And in that time frame, even though the sand of this beach had this reputation for being really, really hard, well, after a couple of hours, his truck would have begun to sink in the sand. It would have settled into the sand. And so John, as he's laying there at some point, would have been trapped by the underside of his truck. And then from that point, either the truck just continued to settle, ultimately crushing John to death, or it kept him pinned there, but he was still alive, and then the tide came in and eventually he drowned. Either way, John's final moments must have been torture. Sevnica is a gorgeous town right in the heart of Slovenia, situated right along the Sava River, which is one of the longest rivers in Europe. The section of the Sava that flows past Sevnica was a popular destination for kayakers and canoeists up until 2008, when a hydroelectric dam was built across it, creating a sort of dead end for anyone trying to go through that section of the river. They would have to stop at the dam, get out, walk around, and then pick up the river on the other side, or that would mark the end of their trip that day. In 2008, while this dam was still under construction, the mayor of Sevnica, who was in favor of the construction of this dam, he understood that this was kind of a bummer for the people in town. While the dam itself was going to provide more electricity for the town, it did kind of end an era. And so he decided he would organize a final trip down the Sava River past the dam while they could still go right past it. And he was calling this trip the Final Descent. And so he went all around town asking people if they wanted to come, and he finally recruited 27 other people to come with him on this final trip. And so a few weeks later, on July 3rd, after all preparations were made, the mayor and the rest of his crew, they made their way upstream to this loading area where 4 canoes have been set out for them, and the staff people that had actually provided these canoes, they offered the group life jackets, and virtually everyone in the group turned it down. It's unclear why they turned down the life jackets, but one could guess that, the river itself was incredibly calm, and they were not expecting to be on the water for very long, and so they just decided they didn't need one. And so after all 28 people got into their canoes, 7 people per canoe, they pushed off the shore and they began their slow trip down the river. And the mayor had actually hired a photographer to come along with them to document their journey. So as soon as they take off, the photographer is looking around, taking pictures and filming. The weather was beautiful and the water was calm, and everything was just going really, really well. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their journey, they turned this corner and they got a clear view of the dam, which was about 1,000 feet away from them at the time. Now, the dam was not done yet. but it was pretty close to being done. And so the actual structure of the dam, it was built. And so even from 1,000 feet away, it was very obvious to tell that up ahead, there's these big cement archways where the water flows down over this dam. And the whole group pretty much immediately saw they had a problem. The plan, according to the mayor, had been they would get to this dam, but on the left side of the dam, there was going to be a strip of waterway that had not been blocked off yet. Because when this dam was complete, it would completely obstruct the river side to side. But because it wasn't actually done yet, the construction crew had told the mayor that, yep, the left side, there's going to be an area where you can basically just casually go right past. You won't go down the dam. It's totally safe. But here this group is on the water looking at the dam. And even from 1,000 feet away, it was obvious there was no side way to get around the dam. You clearly had to go through the dam, or you had to get out and go around the dam. Now, the river was moving very, very slowly. There wasn't a strong current. And so there wasn't some urgent decision that needed to be made about what they were going to do. The group intuitively knew that the right choice here is to, go to the side, get out of your canoes, and either go around or just end the trip right there. But the mayor and a few of the other people in the other canoes got the idea that, hey, why don't we just go over the dam? I know we're not supposed to, and the construction crew explicitly said, don't go over the dam, it's extremely dangerous. But from the looks of it, it doesn't look that bad. And truthfully, it did not look too bad. This was not some enormous dam with some huge drop off. It was actually a pretty small dam where the water kind of went down this fairly small embankment that was maybe 10 or 15 feet long. And at the bottom of this embankment was some semi-rough water. But overall, it just looked like it might be kind of fun to go down this dam, like you'd be going down a slide with your canoe. And so the mayor was really keen on doing this. He made it seem like it was going to be fun, it was going to be an adventure. And so before long, 3 of the 4 canoes were fully on board with the idea of just going over the dam. The 4th canoe that was not prepared to go over the dam had the photographer in it. And they said, we're not comfortable with this, but we'll pull up next to the dam and we'll just film you guys going over the dam. It'll be really cool. And so after making their plans about who was going to do what, the 4 canoes continued down the river. And when they got about maybe 100 or 200 feet away from the entrance to this dam, the 4th canoe with the photographer pulled off on the left side of the river. They got out and the photographer lifted up his camera and he began filming the other 3 canoes as they made their approach into the dam. Now, the video from this photographer that was released to the public, it shows the first of these 3 canoes actually going into the dam. And you see these 7 people on this canoe. They're kind of happy and excited looking. They have nervous anticipation like they're about to start a roller coaster or something. And they're making their way into this dark section inside of the dam. They're basically going through the gates of the dam where they're going to go down this embankment. And as they go into the darkness, as you begin to lose sight of them, you see the back end of the canoe suddenly pops up because now they're going down the actual dam itself. They start sliding down and then you hear someone in the canoe start to scream and then it goes completely silent. And then the video just ends. That canoe, right after it slid down that downslope, it would reach the waters below, but the canoe would capsize, throwing everyone on board into the water. And these 7 people, they didn't even have a chance to catch their breath before they were sucked under. Not only because the water was rough at the bottom of the dam and kind of was churning and pulling them under, but also because this is a hydroelectric dam. And at the bottom of the dam, underneath the water where they were all these big openings to underwater tunnels. And these tunnels functioned like vacuums. It pulled water down inside and then ran the water past a turbine, causing it to spin, and that would generate the electricity. That's what the dam actually did. And so after the water was pushed past this turbine, it would be jettisoned out somewhere else downstream. Now, even though this dam was not fully operational yet, these tunnels and the turbines at the bottom of them, they were operational. So as these 7 people are dumped into these incredibly dangerous waters and they're getting pulled down towards these tunnels, the other 2 canoes, they have no idea what's going on with this first canoe. And so they just continue on and they go over the dam. The second canoe that went down the dam, they also capsized at the bottom. All 7 occupants were thrown out and they were sucked down underwater almost immediately. The third canoe that went over the dam, they did not capsize, and so after they cleared the dam and kind of paddled away, they began looking around for the other two canoes that should have already been down there. And there was nobody out in front of them, and so they turned around thinking maybe they're closer to the dam, and they don't see anyone, but they see one of the canoes is completely flipped over, and the other canoe has been broken apart in the churning waters right at the base of the dam, and they see the wood from this canoe just getting tumbled around. And so this third canoe immediately turns and tries to paddle over to the base of this dam to try to start pulling people out of the water. But when they get over there, there's no one there. The 14 people that had been in these two canoes, they're gone. Ultimately, 13 of the 14 people that fell in the water that day would perish, and one of the fatalities was the mayor. The only person who survived who fell in the water was actually the mayor's wife, who by some miracle managed to swim out of the grasp of these tunnels under the water and made it to shore. Over the next several days and weeks, police divers were able to eventually find all 13 bodies, one of which had traveled 25 miles away to Croatia. No information was given about the state of the bodies when they were found, and so we don't know if having been sucked down through these tunnels and forced past these underwater turbines played a role in their death. All the public knows is that all or most of these 13 people were sucked down into these tunnels and then they died. Full transparency, this next story was pretty difficult to put together because the details of what actually happened to the victim are just really difficult to decipher. And so I think I've been very thorough and I've done a good job describing what happened, but I'm willing to accept it if I'm not right and this is actually inaccurate. And if you think I am, feel free to let me know in the comments. With that said, here we go. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle. They had converted it into a rotating stage, and they put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages on this rotating stage. And so on each of these 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs about America. And so the way this would work if you were in the audience is you would walk into this theater that looked like a single theater with one stage right in front of you, but really what you were looking at is one of these 6 stages. And so the audience would sit down, they would see one of the acts, they'd see one performance on one of the stages, and then the stage would rotate. And so the audience would remain in the theater until all 6 stages had rotated in front of them and played their 2 to 4 minute long act. Debbie's job at America Sings was at the beginning of these shows where the audience would watch all 6 acts. She would go up before the very first act, she'd go on stage and she would greet the audience. And then the show would start, it would filter through all 6 of the stages, and then Debbie would get back on stage and she would say goodbye to that group of audience members. It was a simple gig and Debbie seemed to like it. And so on July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, and so it was 9 days after Debbie had started her job, Debbie was asked to come in for an evening shift. And so she left her house and she made it out to the attraction at about 10 p.m., which was right at the start of a show. And so she went right inside, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage and the show began. And so over the next 30 minutes, all 6 of the stages performed their acts. And then after the 6th act was done, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage. She said goodbye to the audience. And then as that audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Each of the 6 stages that made up this attraction had a fairly tall back wall. And behind each of these 6 back walls that were kind of in a ring was the center of the actual attraction. And in the center was this circular, fairly tall storage room. This storage room did not rotate. It was stationary. These stages audience and their respective back walls, they rotated around this storage room. The gap between the outside of the storage room at any point around it and the inside of the back wall was maybe a couple of inches. It was pretty narrow, but it was big enough that a person in theory could get stuck back there. So it was a real hazard. However, Disney did not put any specific safeguards in place to prevent their staff from intentionally or unintentionally going into this space. They just told their staff to not go back there and be careful. So back on July 9th, after Debbie has said goodbye to the audience and she's walked towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage she's on to the adjoining stage. And when she does that, she either trips or falls or something happens which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the two back walls of the two stages she was on. And so she falls through that gap and then gets wedged between the outside of the storage room and the back of one of the back walls. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck. And so she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. None of the staff hear her, or they don't recognize that this is a real call for help. And this new wave of people that are coming in, the new audience, they're all talking loudly. There's music playing. They don't really hear her. And anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later say they thought it was part of the show. And so as Debbie is screaming bloody murder, she cannot get out of this gap, this narrow gap she's stuck in. These stages, they start to move because the show is going to start. And because Debbie has nowhere to go, when the stage began to rotate, she got forcibly dragged and twisted and rolled, and her body began to contort, and bones started to break, and she was forced to continue moving through this narrow space because the stage was just going to keep on going until it reached its next position. And so finally, after it dragged her all the way to its next position, Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. She probably had dozens of broken bones, but she was alive and she's still totally stuck and she's screaming with every ounce of energy she has. But again, the audience, even though they heard her screaming, they assumed it was part of the show. And apparently the staff also heard her screams and convinced themselves it was just no big deal. And so 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again. And so Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged and smashed and broken as the stage again rotates to its next position. And she's still not dead. She's screaming out for help. No one is coming to help her. And so the entire show would play out with the stage rotating through all of its sections. And then finally, at the end of the show, when one of the audience members alerted the staff that, hey, you should really go check out that screaming we heard. And at that point, they went for a look and they discovered Debbie, and she was very obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the America Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, at the Like Button's next birthday party, please gift them a 3-year supply of Radithor. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like hats and flannels and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested in purchasing official Mr. Ballin merch, go to shopmrballin.com. If you want to see upcoming deals and promotions for our merchandise, go to our Instagram page. The username is shopmrballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just John Ballin 416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called Mr. Ballin where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most talked about mysteries on the internet. And I think part of the reason this story is so mysterious and so intriguing is because there's this really unsettling audio recording that sort of confounds the whole mystery and really forces you to take a stance about what you think really happened. And so I'm going to tell you the story, and towards the end, I'm going to play you that recording, and you can decide what you think really happened. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. You heard me right. We're going back to the old ways, up to 4 new uploads every week on YouTube, for real. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to clean the dishes for the like button. But instead of cleaning them, just smash all their dishes on the ground. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 12:30 a.m. on August 9th, 2013, a man named Kyle Lawson was asleep in his bedroom with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when his cell phone rang and it woke him up. Kyle looked at the caller ID and saw that the call was coming in from his 26-year-old brother, Brandon. And so, Kyle picked it up, but before he could even say hello, his brother said he needed help. And then he launched into this big story that really sounded completely insane. He told Kyle he was currently driving north on Highway 277, which is this totally desolate 2-lane country road that runs through West Texas, and that 3 men were chasing Brandon. And on top of that, Brandon told his brother that, he's trying to get away from these men, but his truck was about to run out of gas. And so what he wanted Kyle to do was to, right now in the middle of the night, come meet him secretly to hand off a gas tank so Brandon could officially escape these 3 men. But as Kyle listened to this, he was not really actually concerned, at least in terms of Brandon being in any sort of real danger with regards to these 3 men that were chasing him. In reality, Kyle's reaction to this was just being so annoyed at Brandon. Because after hearing this story, this frantic story Brandon's telling him in the middle of the night, he was sure that really there were no 3 men, that instead his brother Brandon was just high again. And he was hallucinating. He was basically having an episode that was substance-induced. So Brandon had a history of methamphetamine use. He'd been clean for the last 6 months or so, and he'd been working on, being a better partner to his fiancée, Ladessa, and also a better father to his 4 children. But just 2 days ago, Brandon had also called Kyle, but it had been to ask Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Now, Kyle did not immediately say, "Oh, here's where you go to get drugs." Instead, he tried to tell Brandon, don't do it. You should not get high. You're clean. You're doing good. But he was pretty sure Brandon had not listened, because ever since that phone call, even though Kyle didn't give him any, resources for drugs, Brandon must have gone and gotten drugs anyways, because his behavior had just been completely crazy in general. In fact, right now, Kyle knew from having spoken to his parents earlier that the whole reason Brandon was even driving on Highway 277 right now was because he got into a big fight with his fiancée and was supposed to be going to his parents' house to chill out. He was basically going to time out for bad behavior. That's why he was out right now. Now, Kyle knew Brandon was very likely high, and so this was not going to be a good time to reason with Brandon and tell him to, just come home or just go to your parents' house because, there's no such thing as these 3 men. You're just high. He's not going to listen to that. So instead, Kyle just focused on trying to calm Brandon down because, again, Kyle is not thinking Brandon is actually in danger. He's thinking this is just a hallucination. But as Kyle tried to do that, Brandon did not calm down. He got more and more anxious, and he's continuing to talk about these 3 men that are gaining on him. And finally, Kyle just said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" But as Kyle expected, Brandon swore up and down that he was not high, and he just kept on begging Kyle to come help him fast before these men caught up to him, "Come give me the gas I need so I can escape, come on, man." At this point, Kyle felt like there was no point even talking to Brandon, and in some ways he just wanted to hang up and forget about this whole thing. This was crazy. He has his own life and his own responsibilities. He shouldn't be babysitting his younger brother. But at the same time, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even if, he resented it, he did love his brother very much. And even though he did feel like there is no imminent danger here other than maybe Brandon to himself, Kyle decided, you know what? I'm just going to go out on Highway 277. I'm going to find Brandon and just get him back home. So he told Brandon he'd be right there, and then he hung up. About 45 minutes later, Kyle drove north on Highway 277 along with his wife in his passenger seat and their 4-year-old son in the back. Kyle's wife had not wanted him to be out in the middle of the night dealing with his crazy brother all alone, so she'd insisted that she and their son come along. And so as Kyle drove down the road, he kept an eye out for Brandon's truck. Now, to set the scene for you, this really is like a desolate highway. There's no real traffic, and really in either direction, it's just kind of open plains and some shrubs and small trees. Like, this is a big, wide open area. It's pretty easy to see way out in front of you. And so he's got a great view, even though it's nighttime, but he can't see any vehicles. Like, there's no truck, there's nothing. Like, his brother is nowhere to be seen. But Kyle just kept on driving and kept on looking out. He was even just sort of looking out into the fields in case, his brother had veered off the road somewhere, which seemed entirely possible. But eventually, after driving for some time, way up ahead, sort of parked half on the road, half off, was a truck. Its lights were off, it's just sitting there. It's not even idling. It's clearly turned off. But as Kyle got closer, he realized it was Brandon's truck. So he had found Brandon. And so Kyle, he pulls over to the opposite side of the road, and he parks his car, and he tells his wife and his son to stay in the car, and he's going to go talk to Brandon, who at this point Kyle is assuming is sitting in his truck, waiting for Kyle. And also keep in mind at this point Kyle's thinking, well, there's nobody else out here. There's no 3 men chasing my brother. He's probably just sitting here, high as can be, and I'm going to talk to him, and he's just going to go home, and we're going to move past this. But when Kyle walked over to the vehicle, there was nobody inside of it. Brandon's gone. And he's thinking to himself, this really doesn't make any sense, because on the ride to the truck, as they were on Highway 277, Brandon kept repeatedly calling Kyle over and over and over again, being like, come on, you gotta hurry up, you gotta get here, they're gaining on me like I'm in trouble, bring that gasoline, you gotta get here. And now that he's here, he's finally reached, clearly, Brandon's truck. It's right here. And Brandon's gone? He's gone from his truck? He didn't tell him that on the phone. Like, where is he? What's going on here? And so Kyle, he's like looking under the vehicle. He's searching the vehicle now for his brother, which is totally crazy. Like, what's his brother doing here? But as he's searching the vehicle for his brother and looking around the area for his brother, Kyle's phone rings. And it's Brandon. And so Kyle, who at this point is feeling really annoyed, he answers the phone and he's like, Brandon, where are you? And Brandon goes, bro, I'm right here. And Kyle's like, no, you're not. Like, I don't see you. There's no one here. Your truck is here. You're not here. But just then, Kyle looked out and there was a car coming towards him. So he saw the headlights and he realized it was a cop car. And so he's on the phone with Brandon. He's looking out at this cop car that's coming up this road towards him and clearly slowing down. Like the police officer is going to stop and talk to Kyle, presumably. And so as this cop car is coming in and slowing down right in front of him, Brandon on the phone says to Kyle, run away from that cop. Now think about this. That meant Brandon had to be somewhere nearby because he can clearly see the cop car approaching Kyle. He's watching the scene. Even though Kyle has not found his brother, Brandon is clearly actually nearby. But Kyle, he's sort of quickly interpreting this and he's thinking, like, where is Brandon? Because he's looking out and it's just open fields in either direction on either side of this highway. It's like this barren wasteland out in the middle of Texas. Like, where is he hiding? There's nowhere to hide. There's a couple of shrubs and really small trees sort of off in the distance, but like there's really nowhere to hide. So where is Brandon? And Kyle, he's just feeling furious at this point. Confused, but furious. It's like, what are you doing, Brandon? Like, he knew the reason Brandon wanted Kyle to run also is because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest that had to do with a drug charge. And so he's just protecting himself, like, don't get involved with the police, like, keep me out of it. And it's like, Kyle, he's already out here in the middle of the night doing this crap for his brother who's completely off his rocker. Like, he was so annoyed, but again, it's like, what does he even do? He has no idea where Brandon is. And so Kyle, he was about to say something to Brandon to demand, where are you? Come out here. But Brandon hung up. Now, by this point, the police officer had arrived on scene. He had parked his car, and he walked over to Kyle, who now is standing right next to his brother's vehicle. He's put his phone back in his pocket. And the officer, when he got close enough, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department. And he told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker about a stranded driver on the road. And so he asked Kyle if maybe that was him. Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver? Pointing to Brandon's truck. But Kyle said no, it was not his. It belonged to his brother. But despite how much he really wished he could say the truth, he wanted to protect his brother. So he couldn't tell the deputy that, the reason my brother left his car here is because he's probably high on meth and he's somewhere nearby hiding. And also he has a warrant out for his arrest. So instead, Kyle said, I think he went off to get some gas because he called me and he said he had run out of gas. So he parked his car here. So he probably has walked on and I just got here. Is it okay with you if I get back in the car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon? Because I'm sure he's fine, but he called me to help get him gas. So do you mind if I do that? And surprisingly, the deputy was like, yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. And so Kyle, he got right back into his car with his wife and his son, and he did fire up his car and he drove farther down the highway. And as he did, he kept looking over his shoulder to see what the cop was going to do. And the cop was just still parked next to Brandon's car. And eventually, when Kyle drove far enough that he knew the cop couldn't see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road and he began really angrily calling his brother over and over and over again to get him back on the phone. But Brandon never answered the calls. And so at this point, Kyle has no idea what's going on with Brandon. I mean, he didn't before, but now especially, he's out of contact with his brother. And so Kyle and his family would sit there for a little bit longer, continuing to try to get in touch with Brandon, but to no end. And eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son began crying and complaining because it's so late and he's tired. And, Kyle's wife is tired. It's 2 a.m. And Kyle, he's just so over it. He's like, you know what? Brandon is an adult. I tried to come out here and get him out of this mess. But if he doesn't want to be in touch with me and he wants to hide off the side of the highway, that's on him. I'm taking my family and I'm going home. And so that's what he did. He turned around, he drove right back the way he came, and he actually passed by his brother's truck that was still there, so Brandon clearly is still in hiding. And standing next to his brother's truck is still Deputy Neal. He presumably was waiting for Brandon to show back up. He drove right past them, he went back to his home, and they went to bed. And he figured, you know what, tomorrow I will likely hear from Brandon, and he'll tell me some crazy story explaining what really happened, but you know what, whatever, that's on him. Not long after Kyle had driven past Deputy Neal on his way back home, Neal decided, you know what, I'm not just going to sit here all night waiting for Brandon. He had searched Brandon's truck, and there was nothing concerning inside of it. There was, no phone, no wallet, no keys, things that people would not leave behind if they ran out of gas and decided to go walk to get gas. So it seemed very much like that is what happened. Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and begun the walk. And then his brother showed up, and the whole thing was playing out here. And so Neal figured, okay, well, I have other calls to go to. It doesn't seem like this is a huge emergency. And so he just reached inside the truck, he turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them. And then he got in his own vehicle and he took off because, again, he had other calls to attend to that night. The next morning around 8 a.m., Deputy Neal was back out on Highway 277 just to make sure Brandon had eventually come back and claimed his truck. But no, the truck was still sitting there, hazards on. Now, at this point, Deputy Neal was starting to get a bit concerned about Brandon because, he's out on foot walking to get gas for his truck. And even though it seemed like the risk was sort of low for him, it is possible something could have happened to him. And that's why he had not come back to his truck. Maybe he was hit by a car or, got lost or something. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or, maybe Brandon decided not to claim his truck yet. Maybe he just went home and he's going to get it later. But regardless, it just seemed like Neal really had to go follow up personally with Brandon just to make sure he was okay. And so Neal drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could find the contact information for Brandon. But when he walked in the door, he didn't have any time to do any digging because another employee told him that while he was out, the department had gotten a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had given them a very different story than the one Brandon's brother, Kyle, had told Neal the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past few days. And last night, so on the night that this whole truck thing happened, Brandon was supposed to be on his way to his parents' house to cool off from the fight he was having with Ledessa. But he never arrived at his parents' house, and he never came back to Ledessa's house. And so Brandon was totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, nobody could get in touch with Brandon. They were calling and texting him, no response. After hearing this, Deputy Neal was surprised and also pretty angry, because clearly Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie, because Ledessa is saying this totally different story. And so the first thing Neal did is he went and spoke to Kyle and also to the rest of Brandon's family to get the story straight here. And very quickly it became clear to Deputy Neal that any omissions or even lies about what had happened exactly on the night that Kyle went missing were not because the family was hiding something. I mean, they were kind of trying to protect Brandon, but it was because they didn't understand how serious this situation really was. And so now that Brandon really was missing and nobody knew what happened to him, the family was very forthright that they really didn't know what had happened to him, and that yes, maybe he was on drugs, we don't know, but he really is missing and you gotta go look for him. And so that's what Neal did. Over the next 4 days, there was this huge search that Neal led all around Highway 277, where the center of the search was where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canines and helicopters and these huge search teams, some of which had thermal cameras which would allow you to see body heat, despite covering this vast area all around where Brandon clearly had been, there was absolutely no sign of him. And they also spoke to the homeowners and the property owners sort of roughly in the area to see if maybe they had seen something strange, maybe seen Brandon or those 3 men that apparently had been chasing him on the night he went missing, but nobody had seen anything. And so basically, Brandon was definitely not here. And there was no sign he had been here other than his truck. That was it. And so Deputy Neal and the rest of the authorities who were involved in this search ultimately came to the conclusion that based on the fact that Brandon had clearly been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he had not been seen in days, and there was no sign of him anywhere, nothing, that what must have happened here is Brandon fled. That he's not here because he chose not to be here. That he was never in any danger. He fled the area, and looking here is going to do nothing. We basically have to wait for Brandon to show up at some point. And so for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case. Until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a bombshell. On August 13th, 2013, so 4 days after Brandon went missing, this is right around the time the search has been called off, the officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa. And Ledessa looked extremely upset. And she said that she'd gotten so worried about Brandon that she'd started searching through their cell phone records. And she had found something really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper and she handed it to the officer, and she pointed at a specific section. And this officer, he realized quickly that this was a printed out copy of Brandon's call logs. And what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. on the night he disappeared. In between a flurry of calls to Kyle and also to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 actually terrified her, because Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid the police. He was terrified of the police. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even suggested to him that he should run from the police on the night he went missing when he saw the cop approaching him. And so she said, look, he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But she's like, why then, after calling the police, did he presumably run away? It just doesn't make any sense. And all of this came as a total surprise to this officer and to the sheriff's department. Because until this moment, the belief had been that a trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver. And that was how Deputy Neal got involved, and really this whole thing started. But nobody knew there had also been this other 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch in the area was tiny, underfunded, and understaffed. And at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball when it came to informing the sheriff's department about Brandon's 911 call, because they really didn't know about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department would contact that 911 dispatch, and they would send them an audio recording of Brandon's call. And when they listened to it, they were shocked. Because one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent danger. This was not like a low-stakes call from a stranded driver. This was someone who thought they were in real peril here. And then two, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of somebody else's voice in the background on Brandon's side of the call shortly before it cuts out.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. It's like we're just pushing some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello? Hello?
And so at this point, authorities are thinking, okay, this doesn't necessarily seem like this is just a disappearance. This might be a murder. I mean, they didn't have a body, but the idea that there's another voice and he's talking about being chased through the woods and there's these men coming after him. I mean, this audio recording gave a lot of legitimacy to that. And so the search, which had just ended, was quickly resumed and expanded dramatically. And for the next year, with all these additional resources being poured in, there was this massive effort to find Brandon Lawson. But they didn't find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that highway 277, all over the place near where his truck was. There was no evidence. He was just gone. And so ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. And for the most part, authorities just kind of moved on. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ladessa, would go on to hire 2 private detectives, and they would both conduct these big searches multiple times over around the area where Brandon left his truck and also across the state. But they too also just came up empty. And as the years passed by without answers, Brandon's disappearance captured more people's attention, and it started being featured on TV shows and podcasts. People had all kinds of theories about what had happened. You know, maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere and got attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by these 3 men, and they kidnapped or killed him, and maybe that voice you hear on the recording was one of those 3 men. Or maybe he really had just fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department originally thought. Nobody really knew. And so for 9 years, Brandon's case was full of questions and 0 answers. But then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277 to the area where Brandon had disappeared, which had been searched so many times over. They, this small group of volunteers, would make the biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were combing through this field off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They called the sheriff's department, and very quickly, a team of deputies arrived and cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that same field, not far from the shorts and the shoes, they found a fragment of a human skull. And DNA testing confirmed the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now, you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance, but actually, it just made the whole thing more baffling, because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near his truck. It had been searched so many times. There were thermal cameras and canines and helicopters and hundreds of searchers, and nobody found it? Remember, off the side of the highway, this is not some thick forest. It is like this huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass and short cactus plants and scattered trees. Like, this is an easy place to find stuff. Yet this skull fragment was not found, nor were the shorts or the shoes. It just seems so improbable. So where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is, despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, canine units, the thermal cameras that were used, the hundreds of volunteers and searchers that combed this area for years, either they just didn't see the grown man in bright white sneakers who was in this barren strip of West Texas where it's easy to see anything. They just didn't see him. So that's option one. Or two, he wasn't there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were looking for him. He was somewhere else. But if you believe option two, the question becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? Why? Where was he? And then also, even if you answer that, how did his skull fragment and his clothes wind up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still don't have a good answer. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button asks you to be a reference on their job application, say yes, and when the company calls you, proceed to tell them how unqualified and terrible the like button is. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On Friday, August 21st, 2020, 58-year-old Aristides Polino was driving back to his home in Miami, Florida in his police SUV after completing a midnight shift. Aristides was a 25-year veteran of the Miami police force, and over the last 2+ decades, he had routinely done midnight shifts, so this was nothing new. When he got to his house, he parked his SUV in the driveway, and like always, he went right into his house. He didn't talk to his wife Clara or his son. He just went straight up to his bedroom and immediately fell asleep. About 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., Aristides woke up, and he expected to hear his wife's voice somewhere in the house. So when he didn't, and the house was just totally silent, something told him that something was off. So he climbed out of bed, he put on his clothes, and he went downstairs to look for his wife. When he got down to the living room, he saw his son sitting on the couch, but he didn't see his wife. And so he asked his son, hey, have you seen your mom? And he would say, no, I haven't seen her. But sensing on his dad's face that something was wrong, he said, hey, I'll help you look for mom. And so the 2 men began searching the house, yelling out for Clara, and Aristides began calling his wife, but she wasn't picking up. And after several minutes, the 2 men reconvened in the living room, and they started going over whether or not she had told them about some appointment that day, and that would explain why she wasn't in the house. But after talking about it, they decided that she didn't have any appointments and she should be home right now. And so the men decided, maybe she went outside and she's talking to a neighbor, or, she went for a walk and she's talking to somebody on the road. And so they decided they would go outside and search the outside of the property. When they got outside, Aristides went towards the back of the property and his son went towards the front, down towards the driveway. And so as Aristides is making his way around the back of the property, he hears his son scream out for help. Aristides comes running back around the property and he sees his son standing in the driveway with the door of his police SUV wide open. 4 hours earlier, after Aristides came home, he parked his police SUV right in the driveway like he always did, and for some reason he left the car unlocked. And so he goes in the house and he falls asleep. And while he was sleeping, Clara, who was home, she exited the house and walked down the driveway to his SUV. She opened up the door and went inside. It's believed she was looking for something, although we don't know what she was looking for. And while she was in the back of his car fishing around for whatever it was she was looking for, the door she had entered the vehicle in shut behind her. And because this is a police SUV, the back seat was designated for suspects. And so the back 2 doors did not open from the inside. And there was a very thick partition separating the back seat from the front seat. So Clara could not just reach over the seats and honk the horn to get someone's attention. and Clara did not have her cell phone, so she couldn't call anyone for help. And when she screamed out for help to somebody out on the road to help her, her screams were severely muffled, and the back windows of this police car were heavily tinted, making it extremely difficult to see that there was a person in the back seat of this car. So for 4 hours, Clara desperately screamed and kicked and punched and did everything she could to try to free herself from the situation she was in. All the while, the temperature inside the car continued to go up. The SUV was parked in full sunlight, no shade whatsoever, and the temperatures that day were over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so by the time Clara was ultimately discovered, the inside of that SUV had effectively become an oven. Aristides ran over to his vehicle and he pulled his wife out and he started doing CPR on her, but it was too late. She had died of heat stroke. Her death was ultimately ruled an accident. On May 22nd, 2021, a father and his young son were out for a walk in their small suburban town just outside of Barcelona, Spain. When they reached their downtown, they were going to turn around and walk back home, but the boy pleaded with his father to make a quick stop at the old theater. The reason the boy and many other kids in the town loved going to this old theater was because out front of it was this huge papier-mâché statue of a dinosaur, a stegosaurus to be exact. And so after a little bit of convincing, the father finally agrees and they start heading in that direction. After they turned the corner and could actually see the dinosaur statue, the boy took off running while the father just stayed back and walked leisurely, watching his son the whole time. And as he's watching his son, he can see he gets right up to the statue, and then the boy just kind of suddenly stops and stares at something on the bottom of the statue. And so the father notices his son has seen something peculiar enough to make him stop and stare, and so he yells to his son, "Hey, what do you see?" And the son just points at the back right leg of the statue. And so the father thinks this is really weird, so he jogs up to his son and he crouches down right next to him and looks in the direction his son is pointing. And at first, the father believes all his son is pointing at is this fairly obvious crack on the outside of the statue on the back right leg. And he's thinking his son has just noticed that the statue is kind of falling apart. But as he's looking at this crack that his son is pointing at, he realized his son was not pointing at the crack. He was pointing at what was behind the crack, what was inside the dinosaur statue. And when the father realized what he was looking at, he grabbed his son, stood up, and ran in the other direction and called emergency services. A few minutes later, the police and fire department show up in front of this old theater. They get out and they go up to the statue and they confirm what's inside this back right leg. Afterwards, they go to their trucks and they get out chainsaws. Eventually, they were able to carve a big enough square on this back right leg that they were able to remove the thing that the father and the son had seen originally, and that was a dead man's body. Not much is known about this dead man, except that he was a 39-year-old man who his family had reported missing a couple of days before he was actually found. While we don't know this for sure, it's believed he decided to crawl inside the statue when he realized the belly of the dinosaur was movable. Now, it's not entirely clear how he figured that out. Either the belly was already moved and he saw the opening and so saw the opportunity to crawl inside for some reason, or he was poking and prodding at the statue and discovered the belly was movable, moved it aside, and then again seized the opportunity and crawled inside. But either way, the man crawled inside the statue, and then once he was in the dinosaur, his phone slipped out of his hand or slipped out of his pocket, and then instead of falling out of the dinosaur onto the ground, it fell inside the dinosaur and slid down the inside of the statue until it fell into the bottom of the bottom right-hand leg. And so the man decides to go after his phone, and so on his belly, he slides over to the back right leg, and then he begins lowering himself head first into the leg, reaching for his phone. And so as he's kind of slowly lowering himself down, using his legs to pin himself inside the statue, he gets closer and closer, and he's almost about to grab his phone when his feet lose their grip, and he slips and falls headfirst all the way to the bottom of this back right leg. The space he was in was so tight, he was not able to turn himself around and climb up and out again. In fact, it was so tight, he could barely move. His arms were pinned by his side, and so he couldn't use them to even push himself back up and out. And because he could not bend his legs, he could not use his legs to pull himself back out again either. And so this man most likely began screaming for help, but for whatever reason, nobody heard him. And so after what must have been several agonizing days, the man finally just died. His autopsy has not been made public, so we don't know for sure what actually killed him, although one could speculate he died of either dehydration or perhaps asphyxia from being trapped in this really tight space where his chest may not have been able to expand all the way, and so he would have eventually suffocated. Following the gruesome discovery, the dinosaur statue was removed from the front of the old theater. In the early 1980s, John Harder was the classic, athletic, popular kid at his high school in Delaware, Ohio, which is a relatively small town just outside of the state's capital. But unlike most stereotypes that paint high school jocks as being these total jerks that bully people and they're kind of stupid, John was none of those things. He was incredibly friendly and very warm-hearted and seemed to get along with everyone. John also was known for having a great sense of humor. In particular, he liked to play these kind of harmless pranks that would make people smile, like the time he very enthusiastically joined the cheerleaders during a high school pep rally, despite not actually being a cheerleader himself. John was set to graduate from high school on June 5th, 1983, and his plan was to study accounting at Kent State University the following year. A few weeks before his graduation, John's high school began selling these tickets to a grad night at a huge amusement park called Kings Island. Kings Island was located about 2 hours west of John's high school, and it was home to dozens of roller coasters, water slides, and many other attractions. During their so-called grad nights, this amusement park would shut down their public operations and not let anybody into the park that did not have these special student tickets that they gave to local area high schools. John, who was 17 years old at the time, was very excited at the idea of going to this grad night, and so he went and purchased tickets along with about 20 other students from his high school. At about 3:30 p.m. on Friday, May 13th, John and the other students who had bought grad night tickets met up outside of their high school. While this was a school-sponsored trip, the students were responsible for driving themselves to the park. And so after all the students were accounted for, they all piled into a couple of their cars and they began their journey to the park. After a few stops along the way to get food and go to the bathroom, the students finally arrived at the park at about 7 p.m. And on the drive, John, who had been a passenger, had drank half a bottle of rum and about 3 to 6 beers. And so when he got out, he could barely stand. He was so drunk. And so the students made their way over to the front gate. They showed the attendant their grad night ticket, and they were allowed inside. And surprisingly, despite it being this special night where only people with these tickets were allowed in, it was still pretty crowded. There were lots of students that apparently wanted to come to this event. Once John and the rest of the students from the Delaware High School had come inside the park, there was no rule that they had to stick together for the duration of their time there, and so they all kind of broke into their separate groups and went their separate ways. In John's particular group was his girlfriend Pam, and for the first hour they were in the park together, all they did was bicker and fight. Onlookers would say John looked visibly upset and very emotional and very drunk. By 8:30 p.m., when John's group had gotten in line for this roller coaster, John was now openly saying, "I don't want to be here anymore, I just want to go home." It was pretty obvious he was still just mad at Pam, and that's why he was saying all this, was just trying to make Pam feel bad. And so some of the group members told John, just, "Hey man, calm down, you're overreacting, just try to enjoy this ride, and then afterwards we'll get some food, it'll be fine." But it was pretty clear that John was really worked up and seemed incapable of having a good time at this point. But regardless, John and the rest of the group, they got on this ride at about 9 p.m. and then after the ride was over, they disembarked and they walked away from the ride to regroup and figure out what was next. And they're looking around and John is nowhere to be found. And so after waiting for a few minutes and actually walking around looking for him, they decided that, you know what, he was really upset before he got on this ride. He probably just wanted to walk away and be by himself for a bit. I'm sure we'll see him later in the night. So John's group, without John, just continued going around the park, going on different rides. And for the next few hours, they kind of forgot about John. It wasn't until the end of the night when over the loudspeaker, the park officials said, "Okay, we're closing the park now," that they started walking out and wondering where John was. And they were convinced, you know what, I'm sure he's back at the cars. He's probably waiting for us because he just wants to go home. And so they leave the park, they get out to their cars in the lot, and John's not there. And so at this point, the group's starting to get a little bit concerned because no one knows where he is. They're meeting up with the other groups from their high school. No one's seen John. And so they're all just kind of staring at the front gate, waiting for John to come out, but he doesn't. And then eventually the lights in the park start shutting down and the security guard comes out front and locks the front gate. And that's when the group knew they had a problem. After an extensive investigation by police, this is their best guess as to what happened happened to John. After John and his small group rode that roller coaster around 9 p.m., John very quickly disembarked the ride before anybody else in his group could see him, and then John stumbled his way towards the replica Eiffel Tower that this park was famous for. This tower stood at about 300 feet tall and was built to be an exact replica of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France, but this one at Kings Island was only a third the size. It had 3 elevators that went up the center of the structure, and the elevators would stop at a 50-foot platform and a 275-foot platform where guests could look out and have a great view of the park. While today, the only way to access these 2 viewing platforms is through these elevators, at the time John was at the park in 1983, the park actually had a flight of stairs that went from the ground all the way to the very top of the tower that went right up the middle of the structure, and the public was allowed to take these stairs all the way up to the first platform, that 50-foot platform. And while the stairs did actually continue beyond that, up to the 275-foot platform, the public was not allowed to go any higher on the stairs than that first platform. And so if you took these stairs, once you got to the 50-foot platform, there would be a big fence right on the stairwell preventing you from going any farther, and it says authorized personnel only, don't go any farther. And so the only people that would walk up those additional flights of stairs were staff that had a special key. When John stumbled his way over to the base of this replica tower, he did not get on an elevator. Instead, he took the stairs. So he made his way up to the 50-foot platform, and then when he got to this 6-foot tall gate preventing him from going any farther, he just climbed up and over it and continued walking up the stairs, and nobody stopped him. He finally came to a stop just below the 275-foot mark, and so he's on the stairwell, and at this point he turns and faces the inside of the tower. It's all these metal beams all over the place, and he climbs over the railing of the stairs he's on, and he climbs onto this narrow beam that's actually a part of the support structure of this tower, and he grabs onto the beam above him and just begins walking along this beam towards the center of the tower where the 3 elevator shafts are. Now, there's no safety net on either side of John, so if he slips and falls, he's falling hundreds of feet to the ground. And if he keeps walking and actually gets into the elevator shaft, there's nothing protecting him from being struck by one of the elevators, because the people who built this tower were not thinking about people walking on these exposed beams hundreds of feet up into the air. This is a totally dangerous and unauthorized area. But John just continues shimmying across this beam until he does get to the middle of the tower, and now he's literally standing looking down into the elevator shafts. And as he's most likely looking around, admiring where he was, one of the elevator cars below him began to start moving. To understand what happens next, you need to have a rudimentary understanding of how this elevator worked. A large metal rope was attached to the top of the elevator car, and from there it was thread up the elevator shaft all the way to the top, where it was fed through a pulley that was anchored to the ceiling, and then that rope was fed right back down the shaft to the bottom, where it was attached to a counterweight. A counterweight is just a large heavy weight that's designed to balance this elevator car on this pulley system. Without the weight, the elevator car would just slip off of that pulley. And so anytime the elevator car moved up, the counterweight would move down, and vice versa, making sure that car was always balanced. And so John is standing right on the edge of this elevator shaft, presumably just kind of looking around, admiring where he was, when down below him, that elevator car starts to move, and it starts to actually descend away from John. And so the car itself is not necessarily a threat to John. However, its counterweight is, because if the car is going down, its counterweight is going up, and it's right in the path of John. And so as John is leaning out over the shaft looking around, this counterweight comes screaming up and picks him off of the beam he's on and carries him up into the shaft. The impact on John was so strong that it's believed he was actually impaled on some of the exposed metal wiring on top of this counterweight, and he got totally tangled up in all of the cables on top of there. And so as John is desperately trying to free himself, the elevator operator, there was always a staff member inside of these elevator cars, he actually noticed when John got stuck on the counterweight. But of course, this worker would have no idea that's what it was. They would later recall it just felt like the car suddenly jumped. And so this worker, fearing that something had gone wrong with the elevator car itself, he decided he would ride it all the way to the bottom, let everybody get out, and then ride back up to the top totally empty to make sure that the car actually worked before allowing people back on. And so the worker went to the ground, everybody got out, out, he closed the doors, he began his ascent. He got to that first platform at 50 feet, no issues. He got about 10 feet above that first platform, so at about 60 feet, when all of a sudden he hears an unbelievably loud thud on the roof of his elevator car, causing his car to immediately come to a stop. And then blood began pouring over the sides of the car over the windows. After getting stuck on the counterweight, John probably did everything he could to try to free himself, but he just couldn't do it. However, when that elevator worker decided to go back up again to test the capacity of the elevator car, it reversed the direction of the counterweight that John was stuck on. And so as that car was going up, John began going down, and it was on this descent that parts of John's body must have been dangling off of this counterweight, and they must have struck one of the beams as he was going down, and that beam effectively pried him off of whatever he was stuck on and threw him over the edge into the center of the shaft. And so John would fall 200 feet and he would land on top of that elevator car, dying instantly. The park was very quick to block off the ride and the whole scene and got police involved very quickly. So only a very small number of guests and employees were aware an accident had even happened, and very few of them were aware that it had been a fatal accident. As for the police, they knew they had a dead body, but they had no way to identify the body. There was no ID cards on John, and so they had no way to let his friends know that were in the park or to tell his family. And so it wasn't until that night, when John's friends are out in the parking lot waiting for John to come out again, that they got really worried, and they went up and spoke to a security guard at the front of the park. And that security guard, after hearing their story, would tell them that actually there had been an accident in the park and there was a body, and the police are still trying to identify this body. And so maybe you guys want to go over to the hospital and see if it's your friend. And so sure enough, the friends went to the hospital and they would confirm that the body was John Harder. To this day, no one knows for sure why John did what he did. Some say he was just drunk and it was a dumb decision that led to his death. Others say he was suicidal, but many of the people that were close to him say, no way, he was not suicidal. And other people say, John, he loved attention, and so perhaps this was a dangerous stunt gone too far. But regardless of his reasons, John had clearly intentionally entered an area that was off limits, and it got him killed. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button asks you to be a reference on their job application, say yes. And then when their company calls you, proceed to tell them how unqualified and terrible the like button is. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels, hats, mugs, stickers, a whole bunch of stuff. If you want to buy official Mr. Ballin merch, go to shopmrballin.com. Also follow our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballin. There you will find all upcoming promotions and deals. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today I'm going to share 3 stories that demonstrate that, and I'm going to tell them in reverse order. So it'll go 3, 2, 1, getting weirder and more bizarre as we go along. And also, these stories are of the more spooky variety too. So stranger than fiction and kind of spooky. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is counting something really important and they're taking their time counting through it, wait till they get close to the end and then begin wildly shouting out random numbers just to screw them up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At around 5 p.m. on August 29th, 1954, a 53-year-old woman named Juliet Exline had just sat down on her couch with a book inside of her home in Los Angeles when she got this weird wave of anxiety that kind of rushed over her. Now, there was nothing she could think of that would cause her to feel this way, and she even looked around her house thinking, maybe there was something weird going on, but there was nothing. And so finally, Juliet, she put her book down and just took a few calming breaths to kind of go back to normal. Like, she didn't know what was going on, but she could tell she was super anxious. Now, generally speaking, Juliet was a very mellow person. She was not prone to anxiety attacks like this, and so that kind of caught her off guard. And the only thing she could think of that was different than normal was her husband, Larry, was on a much needed vacation. And so the last couple of days while he'd been gone had been maybe more lonely in the house. And so maybe that was causing her to feel this weird stress. She didn't know, but she told herself, Larry's vacation was definitely a good thing. Larry was an exterminator, and over the past 2 years, he had not taken a single day off. He was a total workaholic, and so when Larry began to talk about wanting to take a break, Juliet had encouraged him to put in time for some vacation time, put in a request. And Frank had actually done that, and as soon as his boss had approved a 2-week-long vacation, Larry had been so pumped he had called his friend, and they had immediately scheduled a fishing trip, and 4 days before, Frank and his friend had driven off to enjoy his time off. And so as Juliet thought about that, she told herself that, even if she was feeling a little bit anxious about Larry being gone, it really was a good thing for Larry, and it would improve not only his life, but her life as well. This was overall a good thing, and so she just needed to kind of deal with this anxiety that maybe or maybe not was connected to Larry. She didn't know. But for the rest of that evening, Juliet just could not get rid of this kind of baseline low-level nervousness she was feeling. And so at some point, she began getting up and walking around her house and confirming all the windows were shut and locked and the doors were locked. She was drawing curtains, checking in closets, making sure everything was totally safe. And then by 8 p.m., when she still just could not shake this anxiety, she decided she just needed to go to bed and kind of sleep this off. But after falling asleep, Juliet suddenly woke up at 10:15 p.m., drenched in sweat, with the most intense anxiety she had ever felt in her life. And she was totally disoriented. She's looking around her room like, what's going on here? And then she heard a voice. It was Larry's voice. Except he sounded funny. He sounded like quiet, as if maybe he was outside the house trying to come in and he was calling to her. And so kind of in a panic, she jumped out of bed, ran into the hallway, and right in the hallway was Larry. He wasn't outside. He was right there. Except something was wrong with Larry. He was kind of hunched over and grabbing his stomach, and he had his hand on the wall, and he also appeared to be soaking wet. And so Juliet had no idea what was going on, but between all that anxiety and now seeing Larry here in this weird state, she couldn't help herself. She just ran towards him to just make sure he was okay. But as soon as she got about a foot away from him, he held out his hand and said, "No, don't touch me. I have to go back." And what he said was so disorienting that Juliet just stopped and stared at her husband like, what is this? And that's when she made the startling realization that Larry was not soaking wet with water. He was soaking wet with blood, and he was clutching his stomach like something was bleeding in his midsection. And the reason he had sounded so quiet when he had called out to her and woken her up was because he was clearly hurt. And so Juliet has no clue what's going on. Like, her husband was supposed to be 7 hours away on this fishing trip. And so how is he here? It didn't make any sense. And so really not knowing what else to do, Juliet just said, I'm going to call the doctor. And so she ran past Larry, headed to the kitchen, and she was about to grab the phone on the wall. But before she could grab it, the phone began to ring. And so Juliet just answered it and said, hello, hello. And what she heard was the sound of a sheriff in Ely, Nevada. And he said, excuse me, is this Mrs. Exline, Juliet Exline? And she said, yes, what's going on? What's happened? And the sheriff said, ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I have some terrible news. Your husband got into a car accident, and unfortunately, he has passed away. And now the second the sheriff said this to Juliet, she just froze and goes, no, that's not possible. He's here with me right now. And Juliet turned around and looked into the hallway where Larry had been standing, and now Larry was gone. Larry really had died in that car accident because Juliet would bury her husband that week. But Juliet maintained that clearly after her husband had died, his spirit had somehow survived the accident, because when she saw her husband standing in the hallway, hunched over and covered in blood, it was at 10:15 p.m. She remembers because when she woke up, she saw the time. It was 10:15. and her husband had died at exactly 10:15 p.m., the exact moment she saw him in the hallway. Juliet would ultimately write an account of what she experienced with her husband. However, from that day forward, she never once saw her husband again. That was the only time. At 12:30 p.m. on March 7th, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down, and then finally when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV upturned, partially submerged, and he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV, and so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here! Come over here, help!" But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, "Come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in." And so all these first responders are pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, "There's a baby in here, there's a baby in here." And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped the straps holding the baby who had been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes at this point, he just took this baby, he turned away, he figured the first responders will handle this woman and he's going to take this baby to safety because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics. And right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing. But he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 25-year-old woman named Jennifer Grossbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know. But we know at 10:30, she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. until finally Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, "Come save us, please." But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. Only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there, and when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard, and they do not have an explanation for it. Do you like scary stories about cryptids, the paranormal, the supernatural, bizarre true crime? Of course you do. Well, I have a podcast for you to check out. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's a weekly podcast from our studio, MrBallen's Studios, that I know you will love if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. With every episode of Bedtime Stories, I feel totally creeped out by the end. They're just so good at building the suspense and just making it feel really unsettling. You may have heard of Bedtime Stories because they actually have an amazing YouTube channel that I've been a subscriber to for years. They're literally my favorite YouTube channel, not a lie. That's the one I go to, that's my favorite channel. But now they're available in podcast form as well. And if you stick around till the end of this YouTube video, I will play you a clip from one of their newest podcast episodes so you can get a feel for what it's going to be like. And when you're done listening to that clip, if you liked it, please go and follow and binge Bedtime Stories on whichever podcast platform you listen on. Okay, back to the stories. At around 9 p.m. on October 26, 2009, a 19-year-old college student named Miyako Hiroka bagged up the last bit of trash inside of the ice cream parlor where she worked, and she dumped it into a bag, and she tied that bag up. It was closing time, and so Miyako looked around the inside of the parlor, made sure everything was where it was supposed to be, and then she flipped off the lights, threw her purse over her shoulder, she grabbed that bag of trash, she headed outside the parlor, she shut and locked the door, she dumped the trash in a nearby bin, and then began walking towards the exit of the mall, which is where this parlor was located. It was inside of this big mall. Miyako went to school in a city called Hamada City, which is located on the coast of Japan in an area called the Shimane Prefecture. And Hamada City was a totally beautiful and very remote location with these amazing beaches and unbelievable mountains with all these ski resorts on it. I mean, this was an incredible place to live. But as much as Miyako did love living there, she was actually far more excited about where she'd be living the next year because she was doing an exchange program. She'd be studying in Russia, and that was so exciting for her. And in fact, this exchange program was the reason why Miyako had picked up this job at this ice cream parlor, because she came from a family that was not poor by any means, but they didn't have a lot of extra income, and Miyako felt strongly that she really wanted to pay her way to go do this big Russian exchange program because it wasn't cheap. And so she was picking up as many shifts as she could to save up money to pay her way. And so Miyako eventually reached the exit of this mall, and she stepped outside into the night, and then she had a decision she needed to make. And she needed to make this decision every night after work. There were two ways that she could get back to her dorm, which was located about a mile away. The quick way would be to just hop on a bus and have the bus take her to her dorm, but that cost money. And remember, Miyako is trying to save up as much money as she can to pay for Russia next year. And so taking the bus just felt like, not really worth it. And the other option, which was free, was much longer and frankly just plain spooky. And Miyako hated it. What it entailed was basically just walking to her dorm, but it would mean walking for about a third of a mile through this really spooky forest that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. Now, up until recently, Miyako's coworker had always left with her at the same time, and they lived roughly in the same area, and so they would walk together through that forest, saving money, and also, providing each other security as they went through the spooky area. But recently, the coworker had quit, And so now Miyako was all alone. And so as Miyako stood there wondering what she should do, take the bus route or take the forest route, she just thought about, next year, it's all going to be worth it. I'm going to go to Russia. I'm going to pay my way. It's going to be awesome. And after all, what's the worst that can happen? It's just a few minutes walking through a forest. I've done dozens of times. Before long, I'll be in my brightly lit, safe dorm room, studying away, and everything will be fine. And so Miyako turned and began walking towards the forest. The following day, a little past 4 p.m., the owner of the ice cream shop where Miyako worked was standing inside the parlor feeling really annoyed, because Miyako had not shown up for her shift, and now the owner, who normally did a lot of administrative and managerial things, was stuck at the counter serving all the customers, basically doing Miyako's job. But when 5 p.m. came and still Miyako had not shown up, and the owner had tried calling her and she didn't pick up, and there was just no sign of her, the owner went from being annoyed to being somewhat worried. And so after again not being able to call Miyako to figure out what was going on, he wound up going through her file and finding her mother's phone number, and he called her. And when he spoke to Miyako's mother, he knew right away there was something wrong. Because Miyako's mother actually was pretty panicked, and she said, you know what? Last night when Miyako was coming home from work, she told me she would call me when she got to her dorm, but I never heard from her, and I haven't been able to get in touch with her since. And so after this conversation ended, Miyako's mother would call the police and report her daughter missing. And pretty much instantly, the police in Hamada City responded in force. I mean, they launched a huge investigation to go figure out what happened to Miyako. And really the reason behind that is because Hamada City is this unbelievable place, this secluded, safe place where things like this did not happen. And frankly, it scared everybody, and they wanted to deal with it as quickly as possible. And so what police did at first is they went and looked at security footage from the ice cream parlor where they knew she had been working on the night she went missing. And sure enough, at about 9:16 p.m., there's footage of her walking out of the ice cream parlor in the mall. She's got a purse over her shoulder, and she shuts and locks the door, she throws the trash away, and then she heads towards the exit. But after that, nobody saw her. There was no more footage, there was no more tips or anything. She just vanished once she left the mall. And so very quickly, this story gained lots of attention because, again, Hamada City is like this quintessential vacation spot. It's so perfect, it's so safe. And to have this girl just go missing, it was scandalous. And so it made the news all over Hamada City, and also people who lived in Hamada City were suddenly on edge at night. What's out there snatching people up? In fact, Miyako's college, during the few days following her disappearance, they set a curfew for all their students. Like, all their students had to be back in their dorms at a certain time to keep them safe. But again, despite the police really leaning into this case from the jump and putting all their manpower and all their resources into this, they really had no idea what happened to Miyako. Then, on November 6th, 2009, so 11 days after Miyako went missing, a man who was hunting for mushrooms up on this mountainside about 15 miles away from the ice cream parlor believed he spotted this beautiful mushroom sitting underneath a few fallen leaves. And so excited, the guy runs over and he begins moving away the leaves to grab this big meaty mushroom. But as soon as he grabbed the skin of this mushroom and began to pull, he stopped. And then he quickly turned and began sprinting back down the path that had brought him up here. And as he was running, he pulled his phone out and he saw he had no service, and he just kept on running and holding the phone up, looking for service. And then finally, when he was about halfway down the mountain, he saw he had service in his phone, and he called the police. And the second the dispatcher answered, this man began screaming, "I found a human head!" When police arrived on that mountainside where this man claimed to have found a human head, well, they confirmed he was right. They found Miyako's severed head right underneath those leaves. And the reason this guy thought her head was a mushroom, a dark-colored mushroom, because it was obvious that Miyako's face had been so badly beaten, and it was all black and blue before she lost her head. And so this mushroom hunter had literally thought that was a big, big mushroom. And so at this point, the Hamada City police shifted their area of search from around the mall and the ice cream parlor where they thought they would find Miyako to this forested mountain area where her head was found. And now, of course, it was no longer a search and rescue, it was a recovery mission. They're just looking for the rest of Miyako's body. And over the next couple of days, as police searched this forested mountainside, they would find different parts of Miyako all over the place. And then after they had found, all the pieces to Miyako, the running theory, based on what they were seeing, is that very likely she had been strangled to death, and then her body was burned, and then she was dismembered and scattered throughout this forested mountain area. But there was very little evidence about who had actually done this to Miyako. Miyako had no enemies to speak of. Everybody who spoke about Miyako said she was incredibly lovely and kind, and really there wasn't anybody in her life that would want to do her harm. And also because Miyako's body had been destroyed and left out for so long, any trace evidence left behind by her killer or killers was basically non-existent. And so the police really had no leads to speak of. They had no suspects or anything. And so they called in psychologists to try to make, a profile of who they thought might have done this. And the best theory anyone could come up with was that this had been a random crime of opportunity, that the person who killed her didn't know her, and that likely her killer was a man who was likely between the ages of 20 and 40. But even that information really didn't narrow anything down, and so quickly this case began to go cold. But as the police investigation itself began to go cold, the kind of lore around the story was only growing. I mean, this really seemed like a totally unbelievable case considering where it happened. I mean, Hamada City is like this perfect place. How could this happen here? And so what started as being kind of a local news story, albeit a big local news story, became a major national story all over Japan. And so all these TV outlets and journalists were descending on Hamada City, and they were taking video of the ice cream parlor and of the police department and filming, Miyako's dorm and her school and her parents' house. I mean, there were people all over the place trying to get any bit of information to report on about this case. And despite there being dozens and dozens of these live reports basically every day coming out of Hamada City about this case and about Miyako, there was one particular news report that took this case from being, totally unfortunate and sad and tragic and horrible to completely unbelievable and bizarre. Shortly after Miyako's remains had basically all been found, but they were still doing some recovery operations up on that mountainside, one of these kind of random TV reporters who was in Hamada City to report on this crazy case decided to set up their TV camera so it was pointing towards the dark entrance of that spooky forest that Miyako would walk through to get back to her dorm. And so this TV news reporter's got their microphone and, they're standing with the forest entrance right behind them, and the cameraman's filming, looking towards this opening of the forest. And the actual report was pretty generic. I mean, this reporter was basically saying, well, coming at you live from Hamada City, just outside of the forest where perhaps Miyako was killed. And it was just like that. It was just kind of talking about the case, and there was nothing to it. At least not to the TV reporter and the cameraman who were on site. Because for them, the entire report was pretty routine. They did their job, they got their shot, they got their report, and then they left. But they streamed it live. So while they were doing it, all these people are tuned in watching this news report live in front of this forest. And something really unsettling happened on this broadcast. While that news reporter was talking, another voice began to be heard by people watching this broadcast. And it was not the cameraman, and it was certainly not the TV journalist. It was a woman's voice. And there was no woman anywhere near the shot. And after the fact, the journalist and the cameraman would also attest that there was nobody around, it was just them. But this detached, very pained voice said very clearly, and all these people heard it live, "This is very painful. Why only me?"
広島県北広島町の我流山の林道の入り口です。今日の捜索は午後5時で終了し、私の後ろに張られていた規制線も現在は解かれています。
And so after this news report happened, this story, this case about Miyako, went from being just a Japanese story to being like an international sensation. Because everybody believed when they saw this video that that voice that was heard was Miyako's ghost, basically talking on camera. That's why you can't see her. It's her spirit communicating with the living world. However, despite that drawing even more attention to this case, it didn't remotely help the police actually solve the case. They still had no idea who did this. And that's how this case would stay for years, just totally stalled. That is, until 7 years later, when a police officer was conducting a routine police review of old criminal case files that hadn't been solved, going through them all to see if maybe evidence had been missed, and maybe that was why the case had not been solved. And so this police officer is looking through all these case files, and when they landed on the Miyako case, they did discover a piece of evidence that had been totally overlooked. It was the file of a convicted sex offender named Yoshiharu Yano. Yoshiharu was a 33-year-old man who had served time in prison for assaults on 3 different women in Tokyo, which is 500 miles away from Yamada City, where Miyako was killed. And because of that 500-mile gap between Tokyo and Hamada City, Yoshiharu had been completely overlooked in terms of being a suspect in Miyako's murder. It just seemed like he was too far away to be involved. But the police officer who was doing that routine review, they discovered that right before Miyako was murdered, this Yoshiharu guy had been let out of prison and decided to live in Hamada City. And on the night Miyako was killed, when she decided to walk into that forest, well, they found security footage of Yoshiharu's car driving along around that forest and up near that mountain where Miyako's remains were all discovered. And so this investigator who discovered this piece of information got permission from higher-ups to search Yoshiharu's home where he was living right then. And when they searched his home, they discovered a digital camera with 40 photos on it that would explain what happened to Miyako. It was very clear Yoshiharu had murdered Miyako because some of the pictures contain photos of Miyako and they are just horrible. But figuring out who Miyako's killer was not the end of this case. In fact, it wasn't even the most shocking part of this case. The most shocking part of this case is what happened to Miyako's killer, Yoshiharu, basically right after she was murdered, and that voice, that detached female voice, was heard on that TV news report. 7 years earlier, right around the time that Miyako's head had been found, and also after that voice had been heard on the TV newscast, some people who were driving in a car north of Hamada City began calling the police to report something very strange. They called the police and said, there is this small white Toyota Corolla car that has 2 people inside of it, and they've driven to the side of the road, and the driver is ramming over and over again against the railing. Like they're smashing into the railing, backing up, smashing over and over again, like the car is somehow in control. They don't understand how these people are not getting out of the car. Like, what are they doing? Traffic had stopped on either side. It was just totally nonsensical. And then by the time the police showed up, this car that was just repeatedly driving into the side of this guardrail, it burst into flames with the 2 people inside still clearly alive and looking terrified, and they caught on fire and died. Now, at the time, this did make the news. It looked very much like some sort of weird murder-suicide where the driver had intentionally, driven the car until it burst into flames and killed themselves and also their passenger. But it didn't really amount to more than just a really weird news story because there was no connection to the Miyako case. This is like a totally isolated thing. However, 7 years later, when that police officer discovered the link that Yoshiharu was in Hamada City, and then they figured out, yep, Yoshiharu was the killer, well, suddenly, that totally weird murder-suicide took on a whole new meaning, because the driver of that car was Yoshiharu, and the passenger was his mother. And again, from eyewitness testimony, it didn't really make sense the way this all happened. It was almost like the car was possessed or something, that, the passengers couldn't control it. Now, who knows if that's true, but when you combine it with the sound of that female voice on the TV news camera that everybody assumed was Miyako's ghost saying, "This is so painful, why only me?" suddenly those words took on a new meaning. People thought, you know what it is? Miyako's ghost must have taken control of that car and made sure not only Yoshiharu suffered and died, but his family member died as well, that she was seeking her revenge on her killer. As promised, here is a clip from the newest episode of the Bedtime Stories podcast. Enjoy.
Despite the invention of satellite communications and GPS tracking, ships and planes continue to vanish from across the globe, leaving no trace of their passing. Simultaneously, the remains of mysterious boats wash up on remote shorelines, their identities long since removed by the effects of weathering and decay. It has been theorized that there are places on this earth where time operates in a somewhat different manner, where some invisible portal or corridor is capable of propelling a vehicle and its occupants to a very different moment in history, both in the future and the past. Could it be that this outlandish theory is the reason behind some of the inexplicable disappearances that take place on a near daily basis?
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed that clip, be sure to go follow and binge the Bedtime Stories podcast on whichever podcast platform you listen to. New episodes come out every Wednesday. So that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you want to hear more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, remember we have a whole slew of podcasts under the Ballin Studios bannerhead. Just search for Ballin Studios on any podcast platform, and you will have hundreds and hundreds of strange, dark, and mysterious stories to binge. Thank you so much. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. On a morning in May of 2014, a detective sat next to the hospital bed of a mortally injured 77-year-old woman. This woman had been in a coma for the last 10 days following a vicious attack on her. And in that time, the detective had been desperately working to try to figure out who had attacked her. But now, somewhat amazingly, the woman had woken up from her coma, and now this detective was finally getting the chance to ask the victim directly, "Who did this to you?" However, when the woman began to speak, this conversation would not go as planned. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please take the like button out for a beach day, but replace their sunscreen with cooking oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late in the afternoon on May 6, 2014, 77-year-old Helene Pastor sat at her office desk in Monaco with a phone pressed to her ear. And on the other end was one of Helene's many tenants, doing what they did best, which was to complain. This time there was a problem with their water heater, and apparently the plumber was late. And Helene, like she always did, listened patiently, because she was a landlord, and this was her job. But when this tenant was finished, Helene told them in a soft but firm voice that the plumber would be there eventually, and that they, the tenant, were certainly not too important to wait. Then she hung up. Helene knew her tenant wouldn't like this, but she also just didn't have patience for entitled, wealthy snobs. Unfortunately for her, though, she spent a lot of time with people like that, because Helene was actually the single richest woman in all of Monaco. So Monaco is a country located on the Mediterranean coast, and it's surrounded on 3 sides by France. And so Monaco and France share a lot of cultural similarities. But unlike France, Monaco is very, very small, just under a mile wide, and has only about 39,000 citizens. And many of those 39,000 citizens are incredibly wealthy. It's essentially a country of millionaires and billionaires living in ultra-luxury condos and high-rises all along its coastline. And Helene and her family, the Pastors, owned most of those condos, which meant they were among the wealthiest landlords not just in Monaco, but on the whole planet. The Pastors' multi-billion-dollar real estate empire had started 3 generations ago, and Helene was now in charge of it. It was a lot of work, and Helene could have passed it off to somebody else. But she was a Pastor, and Pastors worked for what they had. Which was why, despite her wealth, Helene was a very hands-on landlord and spent long days in her office with her staff, dealing with accounting and handling tenants' requests and complaints, like about, the plumber not being on time. Now, Helene picked up the phone once more to make one more call before she left for the day, and this call was to her daughter, Sylvia. Sylvia was 53 and had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier, so Helene, naturally worried about her a lot and checked in with her daily. And on this day, when she heard her daughter pick up and say hello, Helene immediately asked her, how are you feeling? But Sylvia said she actually couldn't talk right now. Her massage therapist had just arrived, and so she excused herself and hung up. Helene took the phone off her ear and just stared at the receiver as the dial tone blared through it, doing her best not to feel hurt. Helene knew she was a very demanding parent and, generally was not particularly warm, but she loved Sylvia. And lately, it seemed like her daughter just didn't necessarily reciprocate that. And Helene knew exactly who to blame for this. And it was not Sylvia, and it wasn't even Helene. It was Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Now, Sylvia had been with Wojciech for almost 3 decades, and it seemed like everyone in Monaco absolutely loved this guy. I mean, he was charming and gregarious and gave a ton of money to charity, but Helene had always felt like there was just something off about him, and she worried that he was taking advantage of her daughter's very famous name. And so generally, there had just been this sort of sitting, unspoken tension between Helene and Sylvia about Wojciech. The fact that clearly Helene didn't really like him. Like, that tension was there between the mother and daughter. But lately, it seemed like that tension had finally gotten to the point where, Helene and Sylvia were just having all these little arguments that, sometimes were actually about Wojciech and other times were about completely different things. It was like they were just quick to argue with each other. But for now, Helene looked at the time and saw, it was time to go. And so she stood up and she smoothed out her beautiful Chanel suit. And she knew that if she wanted to see her son Gildo tonight, she really needed to get a move on here. So Gildo, Helene's son, had been in the hospital for the last few months after having a stroke. Helene visited with him daily, making the 45-minute drive from Monaco to where he was hospitalized in Nice, France. Now, the daily commute was definitely a lot, but Helene didn't care. She always worked it into her very busy schedule. Now, Gildo was 47, but he was still very much Helene's child. And the whole ordeal had been just awful and very emotional for Helene, especially on top of, her daughter's cancer diagnosis and the tension between her and her daughter. Like, right now, life was pretty tough. Seeing her children like this had reminded Helene that money just could not save you from everything, even in Monaco. Now, Helene grabbed her Hermes purse and she headed out the door. Minutes later, Helene was outside and was climbing into a black minivan that was waiting for her at the curb. And as Helene slid into the back seat, she was greeted by her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwich. So Mohammed had actually been working with Helene now for 15 years. And so the two of them spent the entire 45-minute drive to Nice just chatting about their kids, because in some ways they were, longtime friends. Mohammed told Helene about how he really missed his daughter, who lived back in Egypt with her mom. And he also updated Helene on his son, Wissam, and how he liked living in France. Their conversation made the drive go fast, and before Helene knew it, they were at the hospital. Around 6 p.m. that night, Helene was sitting at Gildo's bedside, helping him drink a glass of water. Like his mother, Gildo had been both blessed and cursed with the pastor work ethic. Despite the family money, he was constantly starting ventures and investing in businesses. So Helene knew the hospitalization had been really hard for him, not just physically, but just from a work perspective. He was missing out on so many opportunities because he was stuck here. And even though now he was awake and alert, he was still partially paralyzed and just couldn't speak very well. Helene sat with Gildo for about an hour, talking to him and also checking in with his doctors. And then at some point, she kissed her son's forehead and told him she would see him soon. Just after 7 p.m., Helene walked out of the hospital to where Mohammed was waiting in the minivan. And this time, she got into the front passenger seat. And Mohammed, he started the car, and they began to make their way out of the lot toward the busy streets of Nice. And pretty much right away, they got stuck in absolutely standstill traffic. And so Helene just sat back in her seat and tried to relax. But as she was doing that, something caught her eye outside of the car, like out her window. It was this person who had a hat kind of pulled down low over their eyes, and they were jogging right towards the minivan. And Helene, she just stared at this person and tried to see if they maybe knew them, because it did seem like they were coming right towards this car, like their car. But then she saw what this person was holding. And immediately she screamed at Mohammed to drive. But before Mohammed could react, Helene heard a loud bang and the sound of shattering glass. About 15 minutes later, the commissioner of the Nice police, Philippe Frison, pulled up to the hospital with the sirens on. He'd been in his office, about to finish up for the day, when he got a call about shots being fired, but he really didn't know how serious it was. So he parked and jumped out of his car, and the first thing he saw was a crowd of people gathered on the street across from the hospital. And they were all staring at this parked black minivan with Monaco plates and also a shattered passenger side window. Frison jogged over, and he was technically the first officer on the scene, but a firefighter standing by the minivan told him a few details based on what he'd seen and what the onlookers had been saying. Apparently, a man dressed in black had come out of nowhere on foot and fired 2 shots into the minivan, striking both the man and the woman who were in there in the head. The shooter had then disappeared back into the crowd, and witnesses saw a second man dressed in black follow after him. The firefighter said that both victims had been taken to the hospital in critical condition, but he didn't know, if they were still alive now, and he also didn't have any information on their identities, just that it was a man and a woman. Immediately, Frison's mind went to carjacking. Now, Nice did not have a huge amount of crime, but one of its more common issues was something called the car door grab, which was when criminals would target cars who were stuck in traffic, and they would rob these cars. And so he wondered if maybe carjackers had approached this vehicle and attempted to rob it. Something happened, they drew a weapon, and then obviously the victims inside were shot, and then the carjackers took off. And so Frison radioed back to the station for backup. A crime like this, whether it was carjacking or not, obviously what he's dealing with here is murder. A crime like this needed more officers than just him. And so he gets in touch with the dispatcher and he fills her in on the need for backup. And then during this discussion, she actually passes one more piece of information to Frison that she had recently learned. And that was the identities of the victims. And the reason that they already knew who these people were is because one of the victims was incredibly famous. The woman who had been shot was Helene Pastor. The other victim was her driver, Mohammed Darwich. When Frison heard this, he couldn't believe it. Of course he knew who she was. Everyone in Monaco knew who Helene Pastor was, or at least had heard the Pastor name. And so now that Frison knew the identities of his victims, his theory of this case immediately changed. He felt like there was no way the richest woman in Monaco just happened to be targeted by random carjackers. This had to be a hit. And so Frison, after getting off the radio, went back to the minivan and just looked inside. And right away, he saw there was a purse that was sitting untouched on the dashboard, which made him even more certain that this was no robbery. Very likely that would have been grabbed. But then he noticed something else. The front seats and the floor of the minivan were covered in all these rounded metallic pellets, which he recognized as being from shotgun ammunition, like buckshot, like the inside of, what a shotgun fires or can fire. And this struck Frison as being very strange. A shotgun was an odd choice for a professional hit, because it was big and bulky and you really couldn't carry it in public without attracting a lot of attention. And so this, combined with the fact that this happened in broad daylight, told Frison that very likely whoever had shot Helene and her driver was not an experienced hitman, which was also just not what he would have expected. Just then, Frison heard the sound of sirens cut through the air, and he knew his backup had arrived. A few hours later, Frison was back at the police station talking to his team, which now included one of the city's very best detectives, investigator Catherine Messinio. Both of their victims, Mohammed and Helene, had survived, at least to this point. They were in comas, and their attack was already the leading news all around Europe. But Frison was not particularly worried about, potentially not being able to solve this, because he knew he would have some answers soon. Not only had their technicians processed the crime scene and gathered swabs and other evidence from the minivan, but also Frison's officers had found 2 security cameras near the scene that likely recorded the entire shooting. So in France, it was common for cities and towns to have like a network of closed-circuit surveillance cameras that law enforcement was able to access. And Nice had more of those cameras than any other city in the country. So Frison was optimistic about what the footage might show once it finally arrived. But in the meantime, he wanted to speak to Helene's immediate family and friends and see if she had any enemies. The way Frison saw it was, Helene's daughter and son, who she was very close with, Sylvia and Gildo, they would certainly know if there was anyone who wanted their mother dead. But Frison also knew that her children were not just potential sources of critical information. They were also suspects. Frison didn't have access to the details of Helene's estate, but he knew enough about the family to guess that whatever inheritance Helene left behind was literally in the billions, which meant that her death would likely make both Sylvia and Gildo billionaires. Now, Frison didn't think that either of them had actually pulled the trigger here, but what Frison did think was that both of them definitely had the motive and the means to hire somebody else to do the shooting. But Frison had one big problem. Sylvia and Gildo, and really all of the people he really wanted to speak to, lived in Monaco. And since Frison and his team were French, and this crime had happened in France, they had no jurisdiction in Monaco. So, in order to speak to Helene's children and her inner circle, they couldn't just walk up and demand an interview. Instead, they basically had to ask nicely. The next morning, Frison sat in a very expensive-looking living room overlooking the beautiful Monaco harbor. Now, Frison had been up all night and was basically running on fumes at this point, but he hoped, that was going to be worth it, because sitting across from him was Helene's daughter, Sylvia Pastor, and her 64-year-old boyfriend, Wojciech Janowski. When Frison had reached out to Sylvia and Wojciech and asked them to speak with him, one, he had been sort of surprised at how quickly they had agreed to do it, but two, he sensed really not much emotion, like they were sort of cold and detached and sort of quick to be like, sure, we'll meet up and chat with you about this, as if it was just no big deal. But now that he was face to face with them, it was clear that they were absolutely devastated. Especially Sylvia. Now, Frison knew, as much as he wanted to ask some sort of pointed questions here, he needed to be very careful, because Sylvia and Wojciech did not have to be speaking to him at this point. Like, they basically are just agreeing to do this interview, and at any point, they can say, enough, leave, and he would have to go. So Frison, when he began, he just started out with some very light background questions about Helene. And in a very shaky voice, Sylvia described her mother as being very tough, but incredibly generous. She said they did fight a lot, but it was just over silly things, and they were actually, pretty close. Sylvia said she'd been battling breast cancer, and her mother had always called to check in, like she really cared. When Frison asked about enemies, Sylvia shook her head, and she said, obviously, my mother is worth a ton of money, and so by default, she is a target. But she really didn't get out much. She didn't really engage with the Monaco social scene. She pretty much just worked all the time and looked after the family. Like, she just kept to herself. So I certainly can't think of anybody that would have wanted to harm her. When Frison turned to Wojciech seemed equally mystified by this whole thing. He told Frison that he and Sylvia had been together for 28 years and they had a daughter together. And so, he knew Helene very, very well. And he said that, his relationship with Helene had always been great and that Helene generally was like this incredibly generous person. Especially really with him and with Sylvia. He said that even though he had his own businesses and his own income, totally separate from the Pastors, Helene still would give him and his family money. The mention of finances, though, made Frison perk up. And so he asked Wojciech to be more specific about the type of financial generosity he was describing. And when he asked that question, Frison noticed there was this look of uncertainty that crossed Wojciech's face. And for a second, Frison wondered if he had just touched on something that was kind of a sore spot. But Wojciech went from looking uncertain to sort of recovering very quickly, and then an easy smile came across his face, and he explained that Helene gave her daughter and son, so Sylvia, his girlfriend, and Gildo, a monthly allowance of about 500,000 euros each, which was around 600,000 US dollars. When Frison heard this, he had to force himself not to reflexively raise his eyebrows, because this was like a staggering amount of money to get every single month as just an allowance. It was so high, in fact, that it made Frison doubt whether either of Helene's children would feel a need to kill her. If she's already giving them this much money every month, what else do you need? But Wojciech wasn't done. He cleared his throat and sort of shifted in his seat like he was uncomfortable. And then he said that, he and Sylvia used this very generous amount of money that Helene gave them on household expenses. But, Wojciech said if he was being honest, he'd heard that Gildo spent it on other stuff. Wojciech said, Sylvia's brother, Helene's son, he owned some companies that were not doing well. And so he was in very deep debt. For Frison, he couldn't tell if this was true or not, but it certainly opened up a new investigatory door. So he jotted down this information on his notepad. He was actually meeting with Gildo next. And so if Wojciech was right, then this debt was definitely a huge red flag. 45 minutes later, when Frison walked into Gildo's hospital room, he was shocked by what he saw. Now, he had known that Gildo was sick, but he really hadn't been prepared for just how sick. Gildo could barely move or speak. The only way he could communicate was actually by blinking. But nonetheless, Frison sat down by his bedside and began with a few simple questions. It took a long time for Gildo to blink out his answers, and he really couldn't communicate really anything more than a few words at a time. And it was also just kind of obvious to Frison that even with these short answers, he just was not going to get much. And as time was going by, Gildo was just getting more and more frustrated with basically his lack of being able to contribute much here. And so by the time Frizon left the hospital, not that long after he had arrived, he was very doubtful that Gildo was really in any shape to be planning a hired hit. I mean, the guy really was just not doing well. But, it was still possible, at least Frizon thought it could be, that Gildo had begun preparations before his stroke, which had only happened 2 months earlier in March. And Frizon realized the amateurish quality of the hit itself could have actually been a product of Gildo's illness, like he had to rush the hit because he basically could barely communicate. So far, Frizon thought this case was basically full of contradictions. One of the richest people on the planet had almost been assassinated by shockingly unprofessional hitmen. Both of the children, both of Helene's kids, stood to inherit billions and billions of dollars and were therefore the most obvious suspects. But at the same time, both kids were receiving an ungodly amount of money already. Like they didn't need the money. And I mean, even if Gildo was in debt, the idea that $500,000 every month isn't enough to at least keep you afloat just seems sort of fishy. And so Frizon began to wonder about Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Could he have planned the hit? Because he, not Sylvia, wanted access to Helene's money? And so Frizon pulled out his phone and he called Messinio, the very talented detective, the best in the city. And he told her about, what he saw as issues about having Sylvia and Gildo as suspects. Messinio completely agreed with Frizon. And then she shared something that she had learned during her own interviews about Wojciech. She said that one of Helene's friends told her that Sylvia had been with Wojciech so long, 28 years, without getting married because Sylvia wanted to make sure her inheritance went to her or her child or just stayed within her direct family bloodline and didn't go to an outsider, to a husband. Frizon considered what this meant. It told him that Sylvia didn't completely trust Wojciech, but it also tanked his theory that Wojciech might have planned the hit, since he had zero claim to the Pastor estate, whether Helene was alive or not. But then Messinio said something else that made Frizon stop thinking about the Pastors completely. She said she had found something out about Helene's driver, Mohammed. Mohammed was apparently involved in a love triangle, and had been for years. He was from Egypt, and he had a family there, but he also had a mistress here. And Messinio had gotten the number for Mohammed's adult son who lived with him in France, so they could just ask him about it. And so as Frizon hung up the phone, his mind was spinning. I mean, this whole time, he had thought it was so obvious who the target of the hit was. It had to be Helene. She's this billionaire. It's got to be her. But now he was wondering if maybe the real target was Mohammed. That afternoon, Frizon was back at the station with Messinio. It had been 24 hours since the shooting, and neither of them had slept. But Frizon did not think they'd be able to do that anytime soon because the security camera footage had just arrived. And Frizon had put a lot of stock into this footage. Like, he felt really hopeful that this was going to be what they needed, because it felt like every other lead he had tried to follow so far in this case had already hit some kind of dead end. He'd just gotten off the phone with Mohammed's son, Wissam, who he had hoped, might shed some light on the possibility that Mohammed was the intended target of the attack. But Wissam had been skeptical. He did not think the lead about his father's love triangle meant very much. He said the mistress had been a part of Mohammed's life for a long time, and to be honest, nobody was particularly upset about it. Now, unlike Sylvia and Gildo, Wissam was a young and healthy man, so theoretically he could have been one of the shooters. But Frizon hadn't heard anything in their call that made him think Wissam wanted to kill his father, or Helene for that matter. So now, Frizon and Messinio began scrolling through the security footage, looking for clues that could maybe point them in the right direction. When they got to the point in the recording where the shooting actually happened, they were relieved to see they did have a clear view of the scene, and they watched it play out right in front of them. And just like the witnesses had said, Helene's car is seen turning out of the hospital parking lot, and then a man with a shotgun approached her window and fired twice. Frizon could see that the second man watched the whole thing from across the street at a snack bar, probably acting as a lookout, and then after the shooting, both men ran away on foot, and their faces were never visible in the footage. And so Frizon rewound the tape to see when these men arrived, and he saw they showed up about 20 minutes before the shooting. But it was not when they showed up that was particularly significant. It was how they showed up. When Frizon saw how they arrived, his jaw dropped, because finally he'd found a lead he could follow. Both men were separately driven to the hospital in taxis, and one of the taxi's license plates was clearly visible on screen. That evening, Frizon, Messineo, and a group of officers burst into the lobby of Hotel Azur in Nice. In Frizon's hand was a photo of both of the shooters. After calling the taxi company, everything had moved very quickly. The taxi dispatch had a record of these two men's rides and gave detectives the mobile numbers that were used to book each cab. And it didn't take long for Frizon's team to connect those numbers to two burner phones that were purchased just hours before the shooting at a store about 2 hours away from the hospital in a French city called Marseille. And then, by using closed-circuit camera footage, the police had been able to track the shooters' movements prior to the shooting. First, as they left that store with their burner phones, and then as they boarded a train to Nice, and then stopped at Hotel Azur before getting taxis to the hospital. So, that's why Frizon and his team were at the hotel now. In order to find out who planned this attack, they needed to ID the shooters. They were hoping somebody here could. So Frizon approached the reception desk with the picture of the shooters and asked the person manning it if they had seen either of the men in the photo. And the receptionist said yes. Those men had rented 2 separate rooms just the day before, but they had already checked out. And so Frizon wrote down the names the receptionist gave him for these 2 men, but the names were not familiar. Then, Frizon and Messineo split up to actually go search the rooms. Moments later, Frizon and some officers hurried into a very clean hotel room, and the receptionist had told him that this was going to be the case, because the maids had already been in and out of that room. They had cleaned it. And so for Frizon, even though he did expect, a clean room, it was still disappointing to walk in there and see it, because, had there been any evidence still in here, by now it was very likely gone. However, just then, he heard one of his officers call out from the bathroom. And so Frizon went in there and found one of his officers pointing to where a used bottle of shower gel sat on the side of the tub. Frizon couldn't believe it. He knew no other guests had been in this room since the shooters had been, which meant that gel was almost certainly theirs. The maids must have missed it during their cleaning. And so Frizon told the officer to bag it. It was a long shot, but he wanted to maybe get it sent off and tested for DNA. On May 16, 2014, investigators Frizon and Messineo paced around Frizon's office. Every now and again, they glanced at a document that was sitting on the desk. It had only been 10 days since Helene Pastor and her driver, Mohamed Darwish, were shot outside a hospital in Nice, France. Helene was still alive and in a coma, but Mohamed Darwish had died, which meant Frizon was now officially leading a murder investigation. Now, this was daunting for Frizon, but at the same time, he felt like they were close to breaking this case, because that document on his desk told him that the shower gel they collected during a search of the shooters' hotel rooms actually did have DNA on it, and it had matched to someone in their system, a 24-year-old man named Samin Saeed Ahmed. And through a series of phone taps, they'd also managed to figure out the name of Samin's accomplice, a 31-year-old man named Al-Hayir Hamadi. Now, these names were different from the ones that the hotel had given Frizon, so clearly the men must have used pseudonyms when they checked into that hotel. Now, both of them did have prior criminal records, but like Frizon had suspected, they were not like professional killers. They were just petty criminals and drug dealers from a neighborhood in Marseille that had the highest crime rate in the entire country. So it sort of did make sense that 2 men from that area might agree to carry out a hit for money. But what didn't make sense to Frizon or Messineo was how Samin Saeed Ahmed or Al-Hayir Hamadi could possibly be connected to anybody in Helene's life. The Pastors in their inner circle were some of the richest people in the world. If any of them were planning a hit, Frizon would have expected them to hire, more experienced and professional assassins. So now Frizon wondered if maybe they needed to take a closer look into other areas of Helene's life, like maybe her tenants, to see if anyone had obvious connections to Marseille. He knew from speaking with Helene's friends that she often handled many of her tenants personally, and so it was possible that maybe there was a feud or dispute that they just didn't know about. However, thousands of people lived in Helene's buildings. going through that list would be nearly impossible, which was why Frizon and Messinio had decided that the best way to approach this whole thing was with a method Frizon called the fishing rod. Instead of arresting the shooters, Samin and Al-Hayr, they would watch them and keep their phones tapped and see if they led police to whoever hired them. However, while they were figuring all this out, Frizon's phone suddenly rang, and when he answered it, he got very unexpected news. It was the hospital. Helene had woken up from her coma. And so first thing the next morning, Frizon sent Messinio to the hospital to interview Helene. And then after sending her out, Frizon waited anxiously at the station for her to return. He was hoping that Helene could simply tell Messinio who wanted her dead, and then they could just close the case. Easy. But when Messinio came back that afternoon, she did not have good news. Helene had told Messinio that she was terrified, and she had lots of things that she wanted to tell the police. And at one point, she seemed like she was on the verge of actually, giving Messinio a name or just something really meaningful. But then she'd literally just struggled to breathe, and medical staff had rushed in to stabilize her, and they hadn't been able to finish the interview. Frizon was so disappointed. I mean, they'd been so close to maybe hearing the truth directly from the mouth of their victim. And now they might never know. It would turn out 4 days later, before the police ever had a chance to have another interview with Helene, she died. Two weeks after Helene's death, so in early June of that year, Frizon parked his car and began to walk into the station to start his day. And he was feeling incredibly anxious because Helene and Mohammed's case had really stagnated, and Helene's death really only made the public pressure on him and his team way more intense. Frizon still had his team watching the shooters and tracing their phone calls, but so far they hadn't gotten any more leads from that. They were also slowly chipping their way down the list of Helene's tenants, but so far they hadn't found anyone with the kind of motive they were looking for. Frizon had not totally eliminated his first suspects, which were Gildo, Sylvia, and Wojciech, but he just didn't feel like any of them stood out above the rest. Gildo potentially needed a windfall because of alleged money problems, although Frizon had not confirmed that with bank records. But Gildo's poor health made it extremely unlikely he could have planned this hit. Then there was Sylvia, who was entitled to an enormous inheritance from her mother's death, but she already had a massive monthly allowance when her mother was alive and really did not seem desperate for cash at all. And then as for Wojciech, he wasn't even married to Sylvia, so he literally had no legal claim to the Pastor estate. So Helene's death really didn't do him any good. So all this was sort of going through Frizon's mind as he stepped inside the station. And as he did, right away he saw Messinio come running towards him, carrying a piece of paper. And this paper was covered in lines of numbers that Frizon immediately recognized as a call log. And Messinio explained that they had traced one of Al-Hayr's recent calls and finally found a link to Monaco. The guy he called was somebody named Pascal Doriac, and unlike the shooters, Pascal had direct ties to Monaco. He was a personal trainer, and some of his clients were elite families who lived in Monaco. And a few of those clients were also people that Frizon and his team had examined in connection with the murders. Frizon grabbed the piece of paper and read and reread its contents before he finally looked up at Messinio and said they needed Pascal's phone records right now. Later that same day, Frizon was sitting at his desk staring at a name written on a piece of paper. He had gotten access to Pascal's phone records, and he discovered that every time there had been a significant event in this entire case, like on the day of the actual shooting or the days of Mohammed or Helene's death, Pascal had texted the same number. And now that Frizon knew who that number belonged to, he realized he had been at least half right the whole time. These murders were about money. Based on the police investigation, multiple confessions, video surveillance, and bank records, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helene Pastor and Mohammed Darwish on the evening of May 6th, 2014. Around 7 p.m., the hitman named Samin Saeed Ahmed strode toward Helene's black van. And as he did, he could see her terrified face through the passenger side window as she realized what he was carrying, a shotgun, and she looked at her driver and screamed at him to drive. But before Mohammed, the driver, could hit the gas, he had raised his shotgun and fired twice into the passenger side door. And then Samin just stood there and watched as Helene and Mohammed sort of slouched forward in their seats and began to convulse. Samin didn't know who the people were he just shot. But he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the payday he was about to receive for doing this. After a moment, Samin was convinced that he had been successful, that Helene and Mohammed were dead. And so he turned and sprinted away as fast as he could, knowing that his accomplice, Al-Hayir, would follow shortly after, just like they had planned. And so Samin, as he ran away, he pulled his baseball hat down over his eyes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any cameras that might be in the area. And he ran through the streets of Nice, eventually slowing to a walk before going inside of his hotel, where once he was inside, he went to his room, sat on his bed, and he called the man who hired him. Across the city, Pascal Doriac, the personal trainer, heard his phone ring, and he politely told the client he was with that he'd be right back. He then grabbed his phone and hurried out of the personal gym he had just been in, and he stepped into this grand marble hallway to take the call. And what he heard on the other end of the line was Samin telling him the good news, that the job was done. Pascal smiled, he hung up, and then he began typing out a text message. This text message was for the real killer. That is, the person who'd actually ordered the hit in the first place, to let them know that everything had gone off without a hitch. Seconds later, the real killer looked down and saw they had just gotten a text message, and it was from Pascal, their trainer. And as soon as they saw that, their heart began to race. They were very nervous about what this text was going to say. But eventually they scooped up their phone and they opened the message. But when the real killer read what was on their phone, they felt this enormous sense of relief that they hadn't felt in years, because their plan sort of unbelievably had worked. Then the real killer just sank back down in their comfy, expensive couch and looked out their window at an amazing view of the Monaco harbor. It would turn out Sylvia's boyfriend of 28 years, Wojciech Janowski, was lying about everything. It was Wojciech, not Gildo, who was drowning in debt. Wojciech claimed to be this very successful businessman, but in reality, all the companies that he was involved with were failing and in deep financial trouble. This had been going on for years, and Wojciech had just been swindling his girlfriend Sylvia out of her assets and monthly allowance to stay afloat. And when Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he panicked. They weren't married, so if she died, he'd lose everything. But he believed if Sylvia inherited the family fortune all at once, he could easily steal it from her and wipe out his debts. Wojciech had also been lying to investigators about his relationship with Helene. The reality was, they hated each other. Helene was very suspicious, rightfully so, that Wojciech was after the Pastor family fortune. In 2018, Wojciech was found guilty of murdering both Helene and Mohammed and was sentenced to life in prison. The other accomplices, Pascal Doriac, Samin Saeed Ahmed, and Al-Hayir Hamadi, all received between 22 years and life in prison. As for Gildo, he would eventually recover from a stroke and he moved to the United States, while Sylvia, at least as of 2025, is still alive, and she would give Mohammed's son a job and let the Darwich family live in one of her family's properties. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In December of 2005, a young woman walked down a sidewalk in New York City. There were Christmas decorations on all the buildings and Christmas lights. It was very festive. But as she walked along, she glanced over at a newspaper stand. And she saw something on the front page of that paper that literally made her stop in her tracks, and not because it was festive. It was awful. Right there on the front page was a picture of the one thing in her life that she'd hoped she would never, ever see again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, on the next extremely hot day, sneak into the like button's house and jack their thermostat all the way up to the highest setting. And then once it's there, rip the thermostat off the wall. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods leaned towards the mirror to put on her eyeliner inside the bathroom of her small apartment in New York City. Catherine's phone was sitting on the bathroom counter, and she heard it buzz, but she didn't even look to see who was calling. She didn't have time to talk to anyone, because she had to finish getting ready for her 7 o'clock shift at work. So Catherine had moved to New York City from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer on Broadway. But everything here was so expensive that in addition to chasing her dream, she also had to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. Now, 2 of those jobs were pretty standard. She worked as a waitress and also taught children's dance classes. But tonight, she was getting ready to go to her 3rd job. And this job was not really standard at all. In fact, to her, she was sort of embarrassed about it. And because of that, she was keeping it a secret from almost everybody in her life. Her 3rd job was working as a topless dancer at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers. Catherine honestly hated the work, but it paid really well, and if she wanted to have her shot at Broadway, she needed to pay for voice lessons and dance classes. Now, she did live in Manhattan, which was the most expensive part of the already very expensive city, and she knew that she could save some money if she just moved to a neighborhood where rent was cheaper. But when she had first moved to New York, she had lived in a less expensive neighborhood for that reason, and unfortunately, her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The experience had been so traumatic that Catherine had, at the time, considered just leaving New York and going back to Ohio and just being done with this place. But in the end, she had decided to stay in New York and continue chasing her dream. Now, she did move within New York. She'd gotten this apartment in Manhattan because it was a lot safer, and she also got a roommate to help with the cost. His name was David Hahn, he was 23, and he was one of Catherine's friends from back home in Ohio. But at this very moment, David was not inside the apartment. He'd gone outside to get his car so he could drive Catherine to work. Catherine finished her makeup and left the bathroom, and as she walked through the living room, she stepped over a black dog that was sleeping on the floor. The dog was not Catherine's, and it actually was not David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter, so this dog was just staying with them while its owners were out of town. Just like Catherine, David also had a bunch of part-time jobs to help make ends meet. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment. Now, Catherine and David had actually been romantic at one point. They had dated for a little while, but these days they were just roommates, living together to split the bills. Although, secretly, Catherine did sometimes wonder if, maybe they should give it another shot to try being a couple again. Thanksgiving had been a few days ago, and instead of going home to Ohio like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David, and it had been a really nice time. Plus, David knew about Catherine's 3rd job of working at Flash Dancers, and he didn't judge her for it, and Catherine felt like a lot of people did, so she liked that about him. But the biggest hurdle that Catherine could see to potentially rekindling their relationship was the fact that David disliked basically every man she met. Whether she was dating them or not, he just did not like them. Now, some of these guys, she could understand why David, didn't like them. Like there was this guy, Joe, that she had dated briefly, who really she'd only met because he was a patron of her strip club. But then there were people like Paul, who was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym, who she'd only seen off and on, and who was nothing but nice to David. And even though Paul and Catherine were not dating now and mostly just spoke on the phone periodically, David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just did not like the guy. But for now, Catherine figured, I'm not going to figure out my entire romantic life. I just need to finish getting ready and go downstairs so she wouldn't keep David waiting. So Catherine went into her bedroom and began getting dressed. And that's when she heard that dog start barking at something in the living room. And so, curious, Catherine walked in that direction to see what was going on. A little while later, Catherine's roommate, David, walked quickly along the sidewalk to get his car, which was parked a ways up the street. He was out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he had to hurry, so he jumped in and he drove back to the apartment building and he called Catherine as he pulled up out front. When she didn't answer, he threw on his hazards and he climbed back out to go into the building to go get her. and he had just made it up the flight of stairs that led to his second-floor apartment, and he was going down the hallway when he saw something that made him come to an abrupt stop. It was that black dog that he was dog-sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway outside of his apartment door. David blinked and then realized that his neighbor, a man he rarely interacted with named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. And Brad was holding a leash that was clearly clipped onto the dog's collar. For a second, Brad looked surprised, and David was just completely confused about why this guy had the dog that he was dog-sitting on a leash. But then Brad told David that he had found the dog wandering around, recognized it as David's, and brought it back to his apartment. Brad said he had just knocked on David's apartment door, but so far nobody had answered. So at this point, David understood, why Brad has the dog. But he didn't know why the dog was out of the apartment in the first place. But he kept that to himself and just thanked Brad, took the leash, and then stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The apartment door was shut, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had left it unlocked or not, so he just opened it, and he called out Catherine's name. But there was no answer, which was weird, so he stepped inside. Now, he didn't see Catherine, but he did see the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open, so he walked over to it, and he called out to her again. And then when she didn't call back, he tried pushing her door open. But the door didn't really open. It instead swung maybe a few inches and then stopped. And David felt resistance on the other side, like something maybe on the ground was holding the door from opening all the way. And so now, with all these strange things happening, David's starting to feel pretty worried. And so the surge of adrenaline came over him, and he just shoved the door open, and he stuck his head in, and he looked inside. And when he saw what was in there, he immediately pulled back, turned around, ran into the hallway, and he called the police. A half an hour later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up a flight of stairs at an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city was known to be extremely safe. Homicides never really happened here. But if the 911 caller had been telling the truth, Getz knew that a potential grisly murder scene was in fact waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he reached the second floor landing, he saw there were already a few other NYPD officers on the scene, and one of them was speaking to this young, skinny guy standing in the hallway who looked really upset, and he was holding a leash that was connected to a black dog. Another officer walked over to Getz and filled him in. He said the man that was being spoken to was the victim's roommate, David Hahn, and he was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and then walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the apartment door. His plan was to look at the scene himself before he began questioning anyone. Getz put on some disposable rubber gloves and checked out the door frame to the actual apartment, and then he also looked at the door itself. But he didn't see any damage that could signify forced entry. So he stepped into the apartment, and he saw that the small living room was a little bit messy. But it wasn't like it had been ransacked or something. The futon was pulled out, and there were some men's clothes strewn around, but it sort of looked like a typical place that people lived. And so Getz walked through the living room, being careful not to disturb anything, and he went towards what he assumed was the bedroom, where the body was. The door was open just wide enough that Getz was able to get through. And when he stepped through and was inside the room, he saw blood everywhere. It was all over the walls and the furniture, and the room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. One of the dresser drawers was open, and lots of women's clothing was scattered all over the place, and the mattress had been completely taken off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor, and that's actually what was blocking the door from opening all the way. And then, in the middle of the room, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and the t-shirt had a very obvious shoe print on it, like whoever had killed Catherine had stepped on her. And there were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands and arms, which Getz knew meant she must have fought back against her attacker. But the worst injuries she sustained were definitely to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat so deeply that they had almost decapitated her. And so to Getz, right away, it seemed like whoever killed Catherine had been in an absolute rage. At that point, Getz heard footsteps coming from behind him, and he stood up and he turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. Now, the blocked door was making maneuvering in and out of this bedroom pretty difficult. So one of the first things the forensics team did was to pick up the mattress and carefully lean it against the wall, so the bedroom door could now swing open all the way. Then Detective Getz just stepped back and let the forensics team get to work. He watched as they pulled that shoe print off the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. And then also there was a second identical shoe print that was on her bed sheets that they also grabbed. To Getz, both of these prints did appear to be from the exact same shoe, and to the naked eye, these prints appeared, at least to Getz, to belong to very likely an average-sized man. Detective Getz was immediately curious about something, so he stepped out of the bedroom into the living room, and he quickly found a couple pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor. And although the tread of these shoes did not match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, they did appear to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m. on November 27, 2005, Detective Getz sat down at a table inside of an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. And once he did, he handed a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim, and Detective Getz' current number one suspect. There had been no sign of forced entry at the apartment that David and Catherine shared, which meant that Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by somebody who did. And the murder had been committed with a knife in a really savage way that struck Getz as being a personally motivated attack. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been trashed, nothing seemed to have been stolen, and because Catherine had been found partially undressed, there was potentially a sexual motive at play as well. So Getz's working theory here was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well and had easy access to her living space. And David fit that profile to a T. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and brought out his notepad, he did a quick scan of David's forearms and his hands, and he saw that David had no visible cuts, scrapes, or bruises. The detective thought that Catherine's killer likely would have some injuries there because she had obviously been fighting for her life. She would have left a mark on them. But Getz didn't say anything about this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward and he asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a bit, but he took a deep breath to calm himself, and he said that he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40 p.m. That was when he had left to go get his car so he could come back and drive Catherine to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But he said retrieving his car had taken longer than he expected, because on the way, he had run into some of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them. He said after he had done that and he had gotten his car and he went back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting outside by the curb. But when he got there, there was no sign of her, and she didn't answer when he called her. So David said he'd ultimately gone inside and ran upstairs to the apartment, and in the hallway he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was oddly holding the leash of the black dog that David was supposed to be looking after. And then David said he went into his apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. David said he had called 911 right away. It was right around 7 p.m. And at this, Getz stopped writing on the notepad and just looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he'd only been out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and that in that narrow window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered and the killer had also escaped. It honestly sounded like one of the worst alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't want David to know just how close he was to getting arrested for murder, because he didn't want David to get scared and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very sympathetic as he asked how long David had known Catherine for. David said they had met back in Ohio a few years ago while Catherine was visiting her hometown. They'd begun dating, and he had ultimately moved out to New York to live with her. But it wasn't long before Catherine broke up with him and then asked him to move out. But David said he had not been able to afford his own place, so he had started sleeping in his car. And Catherine had felt bad about that, so she had ultimately let him move back in on the condition that he slept on the futon out in the living room. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page, because David was not just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see Catherine alive and discovered her body. Getz was more confident than ever that he was sitting across from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but right now, he needed to go check on something. David agreed to wait, and Getz stood up to leave. But He stopped at the door, and he asked David for one last thing before he left. He asked what his shoe size was. And without missing a beat, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down, and then he left. What he hadn't told David was the reason he was stepping out of the room was to go get some information from the NYPD's forensics team and the uniformed officers who were currently questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, so about 3 p.m. the next day, Getz was sitting at his desk feeling completely exhausted, but was pounding yet another cup of coffee. He'd been up all night interrogating David, who was still literally sitting right down the hall in the interrogation room. And also, Getz had been going back and forth with the forensics team and other officers and detectives who were out in the neighborhood, and he still had loads more to do before he could finally go to sleep. Right now, Getz was going over a new batch of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking the neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. And just like Getz had hoped, the information they were getting did contradict pieces of David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 p.m. and said that at that time, Catherine was fine. But two neighbors said they heard screams coming from the apartment before 6:40 p.m. The man in the unit directly above David and Catherine said he had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. And the people in the unit next door to David and Catherine said they'd heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture moving around even earlier, between 5:45 and 6 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had done anything about these noises because the noises had stopped pretty quickly. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had said he had found the black dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had said that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 p.m., a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew witnesses were often bad with time, and in a dense New York City apartment building, there were lots of noises coming from lots of units, but still, it looked to him like David's alibi had serious problems. And so the detective sat back and had some more coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the forensics team with an update about those shoe prints that were on Catherine's shirt and the bedsheets. And the prints were indeed left behind by a roughly average-sized man. They were a men's size 10.5. And this was the exact size Getz knew David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room to have yet another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer David a water. He just sat down and he confronted him with all these new facts. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his shoe size, that his neighbors had heard screams before David had supposedly left the building, and that Brad said he'd seen David in the hallway at least a half an hour earlier than David had claimed he was there. Getz leaned in and told David that there were also security cameras in the apartment building, and his officers were already in the process of getting access to that footage. So if David had anything to say, he better say it now. Getz watched as David's expression went from exhausted to clearly afraid. It seemed like this might be the first time that David realized the police truly did not believe his story. And after a second of just stunned silence, David insisted that he had not killed Catherine, and he begged Getz to believe him. But when Getz just glared back at him completely unmoved, David launched into a whole new story, one he had not mentioned at all over the last 20 hours of interrogation. David said Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. She had dated him, but David had always thought he was kind of a creep. And David said Catherine had told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So David said the police really ought to go investigate Paul, not him. To Getz, this seemed like a desperate last-minute attempt to cast suspicion on somebody else. But he knew he did have to follow every lead, so he did write down Paul's name and told David they'd look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room, and reporters from all the daily papers were beginning to assemble right outside. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder and pictures of her smiling face were all over the news. The front page of the New York Daily News carried a headline that made Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." Inside, the article reported that Catherine's family hadn't known she was working as a topless dancer until they literally flew to the city from Ohio to collect her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers seemed intent on running with it. And a media circus was like the last thing Getz wanted. His team was already under enough pressure to make an arrest as it was, and it was going to be even harder to do their jobs now that a bunch of tips were going to be flooding in from the public from all this media. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He'd finished the day yesterday feeling pretty confident that David was his murderer. So when he'd sent David home, he had given him instructions not to leave the city, because he intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, Getz did need to follow up on the other leads he had, to hopefully rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man that David had named, who officers had tracked down and brought in, the man who supposedly was obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look at Paul's shoes, and he could see that they were a pretty typical size too. At a glance, they looked like they could also be a 10.5. Getz also looked for scratches or bruises on Paul's skin, in particular on his forearms and his hands. And he did see one. There was a small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked about it, and Paul said his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken, and he said he'd heard all about Catherine's death in the papers, and he just wanted to help if he could. When Getz told him that they'd gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes and said, David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they'd been dating off and on ever since. At the time of Catherine's death, he said they had been off, but Paul said he still cared about her and had hoped that maybe one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't actually seen Catherine on the day of her death, but that he had actually spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon, which was not unusual. The two did speak on the phone from time to time. That's all it was. Paul said he actually had tried calling her a second time that day, but she didn't answer. But Paul said he really didn't think much of it. And then Paul said that night he wound up going shopping with some friends and then also to a local bar to watch the Jets game at about 8:30. Getz made a note to follow up on Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have killed Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up, and he said there had been some stalker guy named Joe who'd been one of Catherine's regulars at the strip club. Months ago, he'd somehow gotten Catherine's phone number and had reached out to her outside of the club. And around that same time, Catherine had actually gotten roofied during one of her strip club shifts. A roofie is called the date rape drug. It basically makes you incapacitated and effectively unconscious. You don't remember anything. People will be given a roofie and then be sexually assaulted. That's often its use. And even though he'd never been able to prove this, Paul always suspected it had been Joe who gave Catherine that roofie. Catherine had cut off contact with Joe, but the whole incident had bothered Paul so much that he tried to convince Catherine to just quit the exotic dancing scene, but she refused. Paul admitted that he actually went on to call Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her. And Catherine had been so mad about that she stopped talking to Paul for weeks. And so Getz jotted all this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this guy Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but it was definitely in Catherine's phone, because the last time Paul ever spoke on the phone with Catherine, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that really surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. And at this, Getz studied Paul's face, looking for any hint of deception. This whole Joe story seemed like it might just be a way to deflect suspicion from Paul himself. But it really didn't feel like Paul was lying here. And besides, Catherine's phone records would be simple enough to verify. Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of Catherine's customers at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling really annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been a call from another reporter, but Getz hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. But for now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he'd subpoenaed yesterday, and they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. Both he and Joe had called Catherine shortly before she died. So he'd brought in Joe for an interview, and he asked him to explain why, after months of silence, he had called Catherine right before she turned up dead. and Joe had replied he'd only called her to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He had claimed that he was really just trying to be friendly. But then Getz just asked Joe point blank if he had ever roofied anyone's drink before. And at this, Joe's eyes went wide and he kind of sputtered out that he would never dream of doing anything like that. But based on Joe's tone, Getz really felt like he was lying. And so now, Getz felt like the entire investigation was wide open. A few days ago, he had been absolutely confident that David was the killer, but men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually looking more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman, and they confirmed that he really had stopped and talked to them on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would prove David was lying about his alibi, at least in terms of when he was there, it actually showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up with David's story because he said he left around 6:40. Now, this did not prove that David was innocent. Based on what the neighbors had heard, she could have been killed before 6:38, but there weren't a lot of cameras in the apartment building, and no angle covered the hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another, whether Brad Stewart or anybody else for that matter had gone into the apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter, but this time he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and there was this obvious excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they'd just discovered something big, something they completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics team member explained that when they'd first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was stuck behind the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they'd done that, the mattress had actually covered up something that was right there on the wall all along. A bloody handprint. It was not until a couple of days later, after they'd carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress back down onto the floor, and that's when they found the handprint. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news, because now he knew all he had to do was go get handprints from all of his suspects, which seemed like that would be pretty easy to do. But he quickly realized he had a problem, because some of his suspects had already lawyered up at this point, and they were refusing to speak with police, let alone hand over their prints. And Getz really could not force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so that meant Getz was now in this weird catch-22, because he needed the suspect's prints in order to make the arrest, but he also couldn't get their prints unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation kind of stalled out. Weeks went by, and Detective Getz started to get really frustrated because there was just nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. However, the case was still receiving a ton of coverage in the press, and to a lot of people, it looked like the NYPD was just sort of dropping the ball here. But then on December 16th, so 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much actually ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of one of the newspapers in New York. And what this woman said led Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on forensic evidence and numerous interviews, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of November 27, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer climbed the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she'd be getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. And the fact that she even worked there secretly really bothered the killer way more than they would ever let on. The idea of Catherine dancing and giving her attention to other men made the killer so jealous they couldn't even stand it. Now, the killer had tried to talk with Catherine and win her over, but she had rejected him. So the time for talking was over. And so the killer quietly walked up to the door of apartment 2D and reached down and turned the handle, which was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer brought out the knife that they had hidden inside of their sweatshirt. But then something they had not anticipated happened. There was this dog lying on the apartment floor that got up and began to bark at them. For a moment, the killer thought about just abandoning the plan and leaving, but then Catherine, alerted by the dog, came out of the bedroom and looked right at the killer and saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off limits to the killer. And just thinking about that, the surge of anger suddenly overtook them, and the killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, lifting up the mattress as a sort of barricade. But the killer just forced their way past it, and they grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine, she fought back. She began thrashing around, doing everything she could to break free. But she couldn't, and so they struggled and began smashing into the furniture and knocking things down all over the room. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up that knife they had brought, and they slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with this fatal wound, Catherine kept on fighting. And she was so vicious that the killer actually had to brace themselves against a wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos, the killer didn't realize, as they're fighting off Catherine, that they had placed a bloody hand on the wall, leaving a print behind. Finally, when Catherine fell to the floor, the killer was still blinded with their rage, and they just got down there and began stabbing her over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer just jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that black dog that had barked at them had gotten out. Now, the killer wanted the dog back in the apartment, but the dog was clearly on edge. They were still barking at the killer. And so instead, the killer just shut the apartment door, trapping the dog in the hallway. And then the killer fled the apartment building out the back door, where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past came back to bite them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who didn't know Catherine was walking down the streets of New York when she noticed a newspaper. And on the cover of this newspaper was plastered the face of the killer, who was currently a suspect in a murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this person. They, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had never filed a police report. But after seeing that this horrible person was being actively accused of murder, she called the NYPD and she told them what she knew. And the NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's accusation as the basis to arrest the killer. And finally, once they were under arrest, Getz was able to get their handprint. And those prints did in fact match the bloody handprint found on Catherine's wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions of Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep who had assaulted at least one other woman before he killed Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell towers would prove that Paul was near Catherine's apartment building immediately before her murder, and he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car, and then he hustled upstairs to the apartment, knowing Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for 20 minutes, that was still long enough for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine, and slip away unnoticed. Paul was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, December 23, 2005. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.